Thomas Brennan looked at the child and said, "I'm not raising someone else's broken thing." He said it in the middle of the street, loud enough for the hardware store owner to hear, loud enough for the woman sweeping the saloon steps to stop mid-stroke, loud enough for every person in Timber Ridge who had gathered, curious, neighborly, well-meaning, to hear a grown man call an 8-year-old girl broken. The little girl didn't flinch. She couldn't see the faces turning away in discomfort, but she heard everything. She always did. Her mother's hand tightened around hers until the bones ached. That moment, right there, on the rutted main street of a mining town in the Colorado mountains, with the smell of coal dust and pine sap in the air, and a crowd of strangers watching in silence, was the moment Elena Whitmore understood that she had made the worst mistake of her life, and that there was absolutely nowhere left to run. If this story moves you, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what happens next. And drop a like, then tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. These stories travel farther than we ever imagined, and we want to see how far this one goes. Elena had rehearsed the arrival in her head for 6 weeks. She'd gone over it on the train from Philadelphia to St. Louis, then again on the longer, rougher leg from St. Louis to Denver, then on the bone-rattling stagecoach that climbed into the mountains like something that had given up trying to be comfortable and simply committed to being stubborn. She'd rehearsed it while Grace slept against her shoulder, while Grace asked questions about what the mountains looked like, while Grace ate the last of the biscuits Elena had packed and declared them, "Still pretty good, Mama. Don't be sad about them." The rehearsal went like this. They would arrive. Thomas would be waiting. He would see Elena first. She knew she was still handsome. She wasn't vain about it, but she wasn't blind to it either. And then he would see Grace, and he would understand. He'd read Elena's letters. All 12 of them. He'd written back 8 times, and not once had he sounded like a man who would flinch at difficulty. He'd called himself plain-spoken and hard-working. He'd said he wanted a real family, not a performance of one. She had believed him because she needed to believe something. The stagecoach pulled into Timber Ridge at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in late September of 1885, and Elena saw it immediately for what it was, a hard place. The kind of town that didn't waste paint on buildings or sentiment on strangers. The main street was packed dirt with ambitious puddles from a recent rain. The storefronts were functional and undecorated. The men she could see moved with the particular efficiency of people who measured their energy carefully because there was always something that needed it. She didn't mind hard places. She'd come from one. Thomas Brennan was exactly where he said he'd be, standing in front of the land office, arms crossed, wearing a gray wool coat that was good quality even if it had been worn hard. He was taller than she'd pictured. His face was the kind that might have been handsome 20 years ago and had since settled into something more like authority. He watched the stagecoach stop with the expression of a man reviewing an invoice. Elena climbed down first. Her legs ached from the journey. She smoothed her coat, which was clean but showed its age in the elbows, and turned back to help Grace. Grace took the step carefully, one hand on the doorframe, the other reaching for Elena's voice when Elena said, "Last step, baby, right there." She found it. She always found it. She stood on the street of Timber Ridge in a pale blue dress that Elena had mended twice at the hem, her dark hair braided back, her eyes, gray and still and beautiful, oriented slightly upward in the way they always were, aimed at nothing and everything. Thomas saw her. Elena watched his face change. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing she would remember later, turning it over in her mind during the long nights that followed. It wasn't shock or revulsion or anything she could have named quickly. It was more like a door closing, a decision made in the space between one breath and the next. He walked toward them, and Elena's rehearsal came apart. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Brennan." She extended her hand. He shook it once, let go. He looked at Grace again. Grace had tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was listening to something new, cataloging it, Elena knew, storing the sounds and the smells and the particular quality of the air in that place the way other children stored pictures. "She's blind," Thomas said. "Yes," Elena said. "I told you in my letters. I wrote it clearly." "You wrote that she had a condition with her eyes." His voice was even. Careful. The voice of a man who had learned to be careful with his words in business settings and had let that bleed into everything else. "I thought you meant weak vision, something that might improve." I wrote that she was blind since birth. He looked at Elena then, directly, and she saw it. The recalculation happening behind his eyes. The arithmetic of inconvenience. I run a mining operation, he said. I'm responsible for 43 men and their safety. I work 14-hour days. I need a household that functions. I can run a household, Elena said. Her voice was steady. She was very good at making her voice steady. Grace is capable of far more than you might think. She's a child who can't see. The hardware store owner was pretending to examine something in his doorway. The woman on the saloon steps had given up all pretense of sweeping. Two men coming out of the assay office had slowed their walk to a stop. Elena felt it. The audience. The witness. The town taking in its first impression of her, and it was this. Mr. Brennan, she said lower now, perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere private. I don't see the point. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. There's $40 in there, enough to get you back to wherever you came from or somewhere else. I'm sorry for the inconvenience of the journey. Grace's hand had tightened around Elena's. Mr. Brennan, Elena said, and now she could hear something threatening the steadiness of her voice, something that was equal parts fury and humiliation and fear, because $40 and get you back to wherever you came from meant she had nothing. She had spent everything on this journey. She had sold her mother's brooch and given notice on the apartment and written to everyone she knew to say she was starting over, and she had nothing left. Mr. Brennan, I am asking you to think carefully about what you're doing. I have thought carefully, he said. This arrangement was made on incomplete information. I'm ending it. He held out the envelope. Elena didn't take it. $40 was not nothing. She knew that. Some cold, rational part of her knew that. But taking it felt like agreeing to something she could not agree to, like signing a document she hadn't read. Grace spoke. Her voice was quiet and clear and utterly without venom. She said, You can't see very well either. Thomas Brennan looked at her. What did you say? You can't see very well, Grace said again. She wasn't being cruel. Elena had spent 8 years learning to read her daughter's register, and this was not cruelty. This was an observation delivered with the same matter-of-fact certainty Grace brought to everything. You're looking at me and you see something broken. That means there's something wrong with what you're looking with. The silence on that street was extraordinary. Thomas Brennan stared at an 8-year-old blind girl for a long moment. Then he set the envelope on top of the luggage case the driver had put on the ground. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. Elena stood in the street of Timber Ridge with $40 in an envelope, 2 travel cases, and her daughter's hand in hers, while strangers looked at her and then looked away, because that was what people did when they had witnessed something uncomfortable. They found somewhere else to be. The stagecoach driver was already climbing back to his seat. He had another stop to make. Mama, Grace said. I know. Are we staying? Elena looked at the envelope. She looked at the cases. She looked at the mountains surrounding this town on 3 sides, enormous and indifferent, wearing their first dusting of early season snow on their high ridges. Yes, she said. We're staying. She picked up the envelope. She picked up one of the cases. She looked around until she spotted what she was looking for. A woman, roughly her age, standing in front of what appeared to be a dry goods store, who had been watching with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite sympathy, but something in between. Elena caught her eye. Excuse me, Elena said. Is there a boarding house in this town? The boarding house was run by a widow named Harriet Stokes, who had 2 opinions about everything and delivered both of them before you'd finished asking your question. She was short and broad and had the arms of someone who had wrung out a great deal of laundry over a long life. And when Elena appeared in her doorway with Grace and 2 cases and the envelope with $40 she was still carrying like it was evidence of something, Harriet looked at them both for a long moment. $1.50 a week, she said. Each. Includes breakfast and supper. Lunch is your own arrangement. I have a child. I can see that. A pause. She blind? Yes. Another pause. $1.50 covers her too then. I'm not charging full price for someone who can't see my wallpaper. Lord knows it's ugly enough I shouldn't be charging for it at all. It was the first thing that had made Elena want to cry since the street. She didn't. The room was small and smelled of cedar and old wood smoke and the particular mustiness of a building that was well maintained but had been standing through too many winters to pretend otherwise. There were two narrow beds and one window and a small table with a lamp. Elena sat down on the edge of one of the beds, and Grace sat beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then Grace said, "Tell me about the room." Elena looked around. She described it the way she always did, not with compensatory cheerfulness, but with specifics, the things Grace could use. The distance between the beds, where the door was relative to the window, the height of the table, the texture of the coverlet, the way the lamp sat off-center on the table because one of its feet was slightly shorter than the others. "There's a crack in the plaster near the ceiling that looks a bit like a river," Elena added. "What kind of river?" "The winding kind, the kind that can't make up its mind." Grace nodded, as if this was useful information. Maybe it was. With Grace, you never knew what information would turn out to be useful later. Elena lay back on the bed without meaning to. The mattress was thin, but it was flat and the ceiling had good bones, and she stared at the plaster river and tried to think. She had $37 left after the first 2 weeks' board. She had skills, sewing primarily, because she'd been apprenticed to her aunt's dress shop at 14 and had sewn for money when the rent was short and for sanity when nothing else worked. She had a daughter who was 8 years old and had never in her life behaved as though her blindness was a tragedy, which was simultaneously the most sustaining and the most bewildering thing about her. She had no husband, no prospects, no one in this town who knew her name yet. She thought about Thomas Brennan's face when he'd seen Grace, that door closing. She thought about Grace's voice. You can't see very well either. Delivered without spite, without calculation, just as a simple statement of observed fact. She thought, I have to find work by the end of this week. She sat up. I'm going to go talk to Harriet, she said. I want to ask her about work in this town. Will you be all right here for a bit? I'll map the room, Grace said simply. Elena watched her daughter stand up and begin walking the perimeter, one hand trailing lightly along the wall, counting her steps. Not fumbling, not anxious, just systematic, methodical, the way Grace did everything. Elena went to find Harriet. Harriet Stokes knew everything about Timber Ridge that could be known by a woman who had lived there for 19 years, raised 3 children, buried a husband, and provided room and board to a rotating population of miners, merchants, and the occasional traveler who hadn't planned well. She delivered this knowledge in the same way she delivered everything, in 2 opinions, rapidly and without being asked. She told Elena that the only dressmaker in town had left in June to marry a man in Denver, and that her departure had caused genuine suffering among the wives of the mine foreman, who had previously relied on her for alterations and occasional commissions. She told Elena that the miners' work clothes were in a constant state of disrepair because the work was brutal on fabric, and the men either didn't know how or didn't care to mend them. She told Elena that she herself had 3 pairs of trousers belonging to various boarders that needed attention and had been sitting in a basket in the back hallway for 2 months. Elena said she could do alterations and mending. She said her rates were reasonable. Harriet looked at her for a moment. Then she went and got the basket. The trousers were in worse shape than promised. One pair had a tear along the inner seam that ran nearly 8 inches and had been addressed at some point with what appeared to be twine. Elena sat at Harriet's kitchen table that evening with the lamp turned up and worked through all 3 pairs, while Harriet made her opinions known about various subjects: the weather, the price of flour, the mine foreman who had publicly humiliated a woman and her child on the main street that afternoon. You don't have to, Elena started. I'm not being delicate about it, Harriet said. Thomas Brennan is a man who can build a system and can't build a moment's grace. He runs the Caldwell operation like a fine watch and treats people like they're gears that either fit or they don't. It's not new. He didn't know, Elena said, and then stopped because she didn't know why she was defending him. He knew you were coming with a child. He thought, she stopped again. He thought it would be different. Most men think everything's going to be different than it is, Harriet said. That's not a character flaw, that's just men. The flaw is in what he did after. Elena focused on her needle. The wives will come to you, Harriet said after a bit. They'll hear about you. Word moves fast in a town this size. You're a decent seamstress. I can see it in those stitches. And they've been making do since June. I'll need them to come soon. I know that too. Harriet poured 2 cups of coffee and set one near Elena's elbow without asking. What about the girl? Grace. What does she do when you're working? Elena considered this. It was a real question, not a cruel one. She helps, she said finally, more than you'd expect. Harriet made a sound that might have been skepticism, or might have been something more open than that. How? She has a way of knowing things, Elena said, about fabric, about sound, about what's happening in a room. She can tell you the quality of a weave by touching it. She can hear a seam that's going to fail before it fails. She paused. It sounds strange. Everything sounds strange until you see it work, Harriet said. The first customer came 2 days later. She was the wife of one of the mine foremen, not Brennan's wife. Brennan had no wife, which had been part of the original arrangement, but a woman named Margaret Colton, whose husband ran the secondary shaft, and who needed 2 blouses altered for a change in her figure that she described as the consequence of 2 winters of good cooking and insufficient regret. Elena brought her upstairs. Grace was sitting at the small table doing what she often did in quiet moments, running her fingers along the surface of things, the grain of the wood, the weave of the bed cover, cataloging texture with that unhurried attention she gave to everything. Margaret Colton looked at Grace the way most adults looked at Grace, with a combination of pity and uncertainty about how to arrange her face. Grace said, "The blouse you're carrying has a loose button on the left cuff, second from the bottom." Margaret looked down. She looked at the blouse. She found the button. "How did you—" "I can hear things sometimes," Grace said. "Threads pull differently when something's working loose. It makes a small sound when fabric moves." She paused. "I don't always hear it. But you were holding the blouse away from your body, which means the part that bothers you is somewhere in the middle or bottom, and you were pulling the fabric taut before you set it down. That usually means a seam or a button." Margaret Colton looked at Elena. Elena said, "She's usually right." The button was loose. Elena resecured it while she was doing the alterations, and she didn't charge extra. Margaret Colton went home and told 4 people. By the end of the week, Elena had 6 customers. By the end of the second week, she had 11, and she had moved her work to the small room off Harriet's kitchen that Harriet had cleared out and offered at a reduced rate for what she called the shop operations. She had bought more thread and 2 new needles and a small pair of shears that were better than the ones she'd packed. It wasn't enough to feel safe yet. It wasn't close to enough. But it was something with edges, something she could hold. And Grace had mapped the entire ground floor of the boarding house. He appeared on a Wednesday, the 3rd week. Elena heard him before she saw him, or rather, she heard Harriet's reaction to him, which was a sudden silence in the kitchen followed by Harriet's voice going carefully neutral in the way it did when she was making a decision about something. Elena came out of the workroom and found a man standing in the back doorway. He was large. Not threatening large, but the kind of large that came from a life of physical work, wide through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been made for a different scale than most things around them. He was somewhere in his late 30s, she thought, though the work and the weather made it hard to be certain. His face was weathered and angular, and wore an expression that she couldn't immediately categorize. Not aggressive, not vacant, something more like contained, like a room with all the curtains drawn that might have anything inside it. He was holding a wooden carving. Not holding it, offering it. He was holding it toward Harriet with a kind of careful, deliberate patience, and Harriet was looking at it, and Elena looked at it too. It was a small deer, the size of a hand, made from a piece of dark wood that he'd somehow coaxed into something that looked almost alive. The legs mid-step, the head turned slightly, the ears up and alert. The grain of the wood ran along the body in a way that seemed intentional, like he'd read it and followed it rather than fought it. Harriet looked at him. He looked at Harriet. "Can't hear," Harriet said to Elena, without lowering her voice in any particular way. "Can't speak either. That's Jacob Thorne. He lives up at the north edge of the tree line, trades the carvings sometimes for supplies." Jacob Thorne did not react to being described in this way. He kept his eyes on Harriet and waited. Elena watched Harriet name a price. She watched Jacob Thorne look at her steadily for a moment, then give a small nod. Harriet went to get the money. Elena found herself looking at the deer. She didn't have a reason to be in this hallway. She had 6 items waiting for her attention in the workroom. But she stood there holding her shears and looking at a small wooden deer and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, which was simply the desire to look at a beautiful thing. Not analyze it, not figure out how to use it, not calculate its practical value. Just look at it. Jacob Thorne glanced at her. She met his eyes. He had the same quality in his gaze that Grace had. That directness, that unhurried attention, like looking was something he took seriously. She held his gaze for a second too long and then looked back at the deer. Harriet came back with the coins. Jacob Thorne accepted them, placed the deer on the counter, turned to leave. And Grace appeared in the doorway of the workroom. She'd heard them, of course. She always heard things before they happened, or so it seemed. She stood in the doorway with her head tilted at that listening angle, and then she said, "There's a man in the kitchen." "There is," Elena confirmed. "He hasn't said anything. He can't hear or speak." A pause. Grace absorbed this the way she absorbed most information, not with surprise, but with the particular alertness of someone who has just been handed a piece of a puzzle they're already working on. "What's he selling?" "He sold Harriet a carved deer." Another pause. Then, "Can I touch it?" Elena looked at Harriet, who had no objection on her face. She looked at Jacob Thorne, who had paused in the doorway and turned back. She said to him slowly, "She's blind. She wants to feel the carving." He couldn't hear her. She knew that as soon as she'd said it, and felt foolish, and then felt something else. Because he was looking at her face as she spoke, and then he looked at Grace, and he looked at the deer on the counter. He walked back in and picked it up. He carried it to Grace. He held it in front of her at chest height and waited. Grace reached out and found it. Not by accident, not by fumbling, but because she heard the slight shift in air when he'd moved, or felt it, or simply knew, and she put her hands around the small deer and held it. Her face changed. Not dramatically. Just the way a face changes when something external confirms something internal. A small relaxation, a settling. "It's running," she said. "Even though it's standing still, you can feel it. The legs are about to move." Elena looked at Jacob Thorne. He was watching Grace with an expression she had not yet seen on his face. She wasn't sure how to name it, something between careful and startled. Grace ran her thumb along the grain of the wood. "The wood is telling part of the story," she said. "You didn't put these lines here. They were already here, and you just found them." Jacob Thorne's expression did something complicated. Elena realized she was holding her breath. Grace held the deer for another moment, then offered it back. Her hand was steady and accurate. She'd measured him by sound or air or some method Elena had given up trying to fully understand, and she held the deer in exactly the right direction for him to take it. He took it. He looked at the deer, he looked at Grace, he looked at Elena. Then he set the deer back on the counter and walked out. "Whooped it. He'll be back," Harriet said later that evening. "Why?" Elena was at the table. Her fingers were tired. She was on the fourth item of 6, and the lamp was starting to throw shadows she had to lean against to see properly. "Because no one's ever talked about one of his pieces that way." Harriet topped off Elena's coffee without being asked. "People here appreciate them. They'll trade for them, give him a fair price. But appreciation and understanding are two different things." She's 8 years old. "Doesn't matter how old you are when someone sees something real." Elena thought about Thomas Brennan on the street. This arrangement was made on incomplete information. She thought about the way he'd held out the envelope, clean and transactional, the way you'd return a wrong-sized boot. She thought about Jacob Thorne setting the deer in front of Grace without being asked, without needing an explanation. "What do people know about him?" she said. Harriet was quiet for a moment. That kind of quiet that meant she knew something and was deciding. "He came here about 6 years ago," she said, finally. "Nobody knows exactly from where. He doesn't have a way of explaining, and people stopped asking. He built himself a cabin up at the edge of the tree line, built it alone, which I know because Henry Marsh was up that way hunting and watched part of it being done. He trades the carvings about twice a month. Doesn't bother anyone." A pause. "The mines tried to hire him 3 times. Strong as 2 men and probably smarter than most. He won't go. Doesn't respond to their letters, doesn't show up to their office, and when Harding, that's the supervisor for the North Shaft, went up to his cabin to make the offer in person, Jacob opened the door, let Harding say his piece, and then just went back inside and closed the door again." Elena almost smiled. "He's not wrong." "Probably not." Harriet gathered some things from the table. Mine kills men at a rate that everyone around here has agreed not to think too hard about. Smart man stays on the surface. Elena went back to her work, but her hands had slowed slightly, her mind still in that hallway with the wooden deer and the complicated expression on Jacob Thorne's face when Grace had told him about the lines in the wood. You didn't put these lines here. They were already here and you just found them. She had not raised a poet. She'd raised a girl who paid close attention to things, and sometimes close attention to things sounded like poetry to people who weren't paying enough attention themselves. She picked her pace back up. 5 customers tomorrow, starting at 8. 2 were new. She had a life to build in this hard place, and it wouldn't wait. Thomas Brennan came to Harriet's boarding house on a Saturday morning, 10 days after his performance on the street. Elena was in the workroom. She heard his voice from the front hallway, that careful, flat voice, and her hand stopped over the blouse she was repairing, not dramatically, just a full stop, the way a machine stops when you pull its power. She heard Harriet tell him something. She couldn't make out the words. She heard his voice respond. She heard Grace's voice. She was out of the workroom and in the hallway before she'd made a conscious decision to be there. Grace was standing in the front doorway between Harriet's and the street, one hand on the doorframe, the way she stood when she was comfortable in a space and just listening. Thomas Brennan was on the other side, hat in his hands. He'd removed it, she noticed, and she didn't know what to do with that small observation. And Grace was speaking to him. Not angry, Grace was saying, but I think you came here because you feel bad. Thomas Brennan opened his mouth and closed it. Elena took another 2 steps into the hallway and stopped. Harriet glanced at her from the kitchen doorway with an expression that meant I didn't invite him in. I came to, Brennan started. My mother worked very hard to come here, Grace said. She said it without heat. She said it the same way she said everything, simply, accurately, from the position of someone who had collected the relevant facts and was now presenting them. She sold her grandmother's brooch. She gave notice on our apartment, which meant she couldn't go back even if she wanted to. She wrote letters to everyone she knows, telling them she was starting over. And then you called me broken. The hat in his hands turned twice. I didn't. You said burden, Grace said. I think the actual word was burden, but it meant the same. A muscle in Thomas Brennan's jaw moved. The $40, he started. Were you bringing more? Grace asked. Silence. Because $40 is what you decided we were worth, Grace said, and I was curious if you'd thought differently since then. Elena pressed her hand against the wall of the hallway and breathed. She had not taught her daughter this. She had not taught her how to stand in a doorway at 8 years old and hold a grown man accountable without raising her voice. She had simply tried to teach her, don't be cruel, don't be careless with words, say what you mean because you can't afford to be misunderstood. And somehow Grace had built something out of those pieces that Elena didn't fully recognize as her own. Thomas Brennan looked up. He looked at the space above Grace's head, not quite able to meet her face, before finally landing somewhere that worked. I came to apologize, he said. To my mother? To you, both. A pause. I accept it, Grace said. But an apology is a different thing from being sorry. She turned and came back into the hallway, one hand trailing the wall, and found her mother by sound and said, Mama, he's still there. Elena looked at Thomas Brennan. He was standing on the step with his hat in both hands and an expression she did not expect on his face, something that might have been the beginning of genuine discomfort, not the political kind, but the real kind, the kind that comes from understanding something about yourself you'd rather not have understood. She didn't speak to him. She put her hand on Grace's shoulder and walked her back toward the workroom. Elena, he said from the step. She stopped. She didn't turn. The women of the foreman's group, he said. There's a supper in 3 weeks. They'll all need something. I'll send them to you. It was not an apology. It was not the same as sorry. She knew that. But 3 weeks' worth of work from the foreman's wives was concrete and real and would pay for 6 weeks of board and materials and then some. She was a woman alone with a child in a hard place, and she could not afford principles that didn't account for rent. Thank you, she said, and walked back to her work. That night, Grace said from her bed, Mama, can I ask you something? The man who carves things. Elena looked up at the ceiling river. What about him? He came back today. I know. He had. While Brennan had been at the front door, Jacob Thorne had come around to the kitchen entrance with another piece for Harriet. A small owl, this time, better than the deer in ways Elena couldn't quite name. He hadn't stayed long, but he'd lingered a moment at the kitchen doorway before leaving, looking toward the back hallway, as if measuring something. "He's lonely," Grace said. "How do you know that?" "He doesn't talk, but you can hear what people feel sometimes," she said, "and how they move, how much space they take up, how long they stand still." A pause. "He stood still a long time." Elena pulled the thin blanket up over her shoulders. Outside, the mountains were dark and absolute and full of winter that was coming, whether anyone was ready or not. "He might just be quiet," she said. "Quiet and lonely aren't the same," Grace said, "but they can look the same from outside." Elena stared at the ceiling. "Go to sleep," she said. Grace went to sleep. Elena lay awake for a long time, thinking about a wooden deer that was standing still but about to move, and the man who had found the motion inside the wood without putting it there, and what it might mean to build something in a hard place that could last. She didn't have an answer, but she thought she might be asking the right question. And in a place like Timber Ridge, in a year like this one, that was further along than most people got. The cold came early that year, earlier than anyone in Timber Ridge had expected or planned for, and it arrived not gradually, but all at once, the way bad news tends to. One morning in the third week of October, the mountains were wearing a hard white that hadn't been there the evening before, and the air had that particular bite to it that made breathing feel like a transaction you were getting the short end of. Elena noticed it because the boarding house windows had developed frost along their lower edges by the time she was up and dressed, and she noticed it also because the cold changed her work. The fabric stiffened slightly in her hands, and the thread pulled differently, and the women who came for fittings arrived with their shoulders already raised against the weather, and their hands cold enough that she had to warm them before she could take measurements properly. She had 16 customers now. 16 was not a number she had imagined when she'd stood on the main street with $40 in an envelope and the sound of a stagecoach leaving. 16 was a number that meant something. Not safety, she wasn't naive enough to call it safety yet, but something more like footing, like she'd found a ledge and managed to get both feet on it. Harriet had given her a better lamp for the workroom without being asked, a larger one with a clean chimney that threw even light across the table. She'd also, without comment, begun leaving a small plate of something on the work table around midday. Bread, usually, sometimes with cheese, occasionally with the remnants of whatever she'd been cooking. She never mentioned it, and Elena never mentioned it, and they had achieved through this silence a kind of domestic arrangement that required no discussion. Grace had, in the meantime, made herself indispensable, not in the way Elena had hoped or tried to engineer. She'd been careful not to engineer it, knowing that the best thing she could do was let Grace move through the world at her own pace and in her own way, and that managing her daughter's integration into a new place was the quickest route to making it worse. But Grace had a way of simply being present in a room that eventually caused people to recalibrate. She was quiet when quiet was needed, and precise when precision was needed, and she asked questions that were so specific and so accurate that they had a way of making people feel they'd been genuinely attended to. Margaret Colton had become a regular, and she'd started bringing her daughter Adelaide, 9 years old and shy in the particular way that meant she was watching everything. And Adelaide had attached herself to Grace with the kind of gravity that very quiet children sometimes show each other. They sat together at the small table near the window while Elena worked, and they talked in the low, serious way of children who have located each other across some invisible frequency. And twice Elena had heard them laughing at something that had no obvious source, a private language already developing. This was its own kind of comfort. Elena didn't examine it too closely. Things you examined too closely sometimes fell apart. The foreman's wives came the week after Brennan's visit, as he'd said they would. 5 of them, arriving over 2 days, each one carrying herself with the particular blend of social confidence and personal wariness that Elena had come to understand as the signature of women married to men in positions of authority over other men. They were used to being watched. They'd learned to present something curated, and they were used to seamstresses who understood that. Elena understood it. She asked what they needed and didn't offer opinions unless asked, and did the work with the same attention she gave everything, and they left satisfied. The one named Dorothy Harding, wife of the supervisor who'd gone to Jacob Thorne's cabin and been let back out again, looked at Grace on her way out and said carefully, "She has a lovely face." "She does," Elena said. "It's a hard thing, what she's missing?" "She doesn't think of it as missing," Elena said. She kept her voice even. Dorothy Harding seemed surprised, then thoughtful. "No, I suppose she wouldn't." She paused. "I heard what she said to Thomas Brennan, on the street, about seeing. Children say things. Children say true things," Dorothy Harding said. "Adults learn to stop." She left. Elena turned back to her work and found that her hands needed a moment before they'd cooperate. Jacob Thorne came on Thursdays, mostly. Not always. There were weeks he didn't come at all, and no one explained this and no one expected an explanation. But more often than not, Thursday afternoon found him at Harriet's back door with something in his hands. He'd sold Harriet the owl the same week he'd sold the deer, and then a small fox, and then something abstract that was either a river or a woman depending on which way you held it, and which Harriet had placed on the kitchen windowsill, and turned 6 different ways before settling on one that she kept returning to. He'd begun staying longer. Not in any announced way. He hadn't rearranged anything, hadn't asked permission, hadn't communicated any intention. He would complete his transaction with Harriet, and then he would stand in the kitchen doorway for a moment. And if Elena was visible in the hallway or the workroom, he would look in her direction. And if Grace was nearby, the look would stay there a beat longer, and then some days he simply didn't leave immediately. He'd lean against the doorframe. Harriet would ignore this with the professionalism of someone who'd been running a boarding house for 19 years and had seen every variety of human behavior that could occur in a kitchen. Elena was not sure what to make of it. She was also not sure she wanted to make anything of it, because making something of it required an expenditure of energy and attention. She was not certain she could spare, and because the last time she had made something of something, it had ended with her standing on a strange street holding an envelope. But Grace had no such hesitation. "He came back," Grace said one Thursday, not looking up from the piece of wood she was holding. Not a carving, just a scrap he'd apparently left on the counter, and Grace had found it and was turning it over in her hands with that focused attention of hers. "He does most Thursdays," Elena said. "He stayed longer today." "A bit." Grace turned the scrap of wood over once more. "Is he staying because of the carvings or because of us?" Elena looked at her. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one." "You're 8. You say that like it means I'm wrong." Elena went back to the blouse she was hemming. "I don't know why he stays. He doesn't tell anyone anything." "He tells things," Grace said, "just not in words." This was true enough that Elena didn't answer it, the problem she had not wanted to look at directly, and which she found herself looking at now, in the cold October evenings when Grace was asleep and the boarding house had gone quiet, and the lamp was the only warm thing in the room, was that Jacob Thorne was present in her days in a way that had begun to feel like more than coincidence, but which she had no framework for. She'd had exactly one marriage, which had been a good one for 6 years, and then a sad one for 2, and her husband James had been dead for 14 months now, dead of a fever that came fast and left fast and took him with it, and she had not yet figured out what she thought about the future in terms of other people in it. She knew she did not want to be the woman who arrived in a new place and immediately required a man to complete her picture. She knew this about herself clearly enough to trust it. But Jacob Thorne was not offering to complete any picture. He was not offering anything, really. He was standing in doorways and leaving scraps of wood and looking at Grace with that careful, startled expression that kept appearing on his face when Grace said something that turned out to be accurate. That was not completion. That was something quieter and more complicated. The Thursday 3 weeks into October, he brought something different. He came to the back door as usual, but he wasn't carrying a carving. He was carrying a flat piece of sanded wood, a board, roughly the size of an open book, and on the surface of it he had made a series of marks. Not carvings, exactly. More like a language that hadn't been named yet, circles and lines and dots and intervals, arranged in patterns that repeated and varied. He set it on Harriet's kitchen table. Harriet looked at it. "What's this?" He waited. He was watching their faces. Elena came to the doorway. Grace had heard the arrival and was already at her shoulder, one hand on Elena's arm. "Can I?" Grace said. Elena stepped aside and Grace came to the table and put her hands on the board. Her fingers moved across the surface. and her face went through a sequence of things. Concentration, then something more than that, then a particular kind of alertness Elena associated with her daughter, discovering a system she could work with. "It's music," Grace said. Elena looked at Jacob Thorne. He hadn't moved. "The circles are beats," Grace said. Her fingers traced the marks slowly. "And the lines are not notes exactly, but something like notes. How long to hold the sound. And the dots are these louder? Harder?" He reached out and put one finger gently on a dot. Then he tapped the table once, hard. "Louder," Grace said. "Yes, I thought so." Elena's throat was doing something she hadn't authorized. What Jacob Thorne had made, and it was imperfect, she could see that even without knowing what she was looking at, it was a first attempt at something that would need many iterations, was a system for feeling music. Not hearing it, feeling it. A notation that translated sound into something that could live in the hands. No one had asked him to. No one had suggested it. At some point in the last 3 weeks, he had apparently decided that the gap between Grace and music was a problem worth working on, and he had gone away and started working on it. Grace looked up, and in the way she had of orienting herself, she turned her face toward the space where she calculated Jacob Thorne was standing. "You made this for me," she said. He didn't answer. He couldn't, but he didn't look away. "It's not finished," she said. Not critically, just as a fact, the way she stated facts. "The intervals on the second line don't match the first, and I think you need more variation in the dots, something between loud and soft. But the idea is right." He pulled the board toward him and looked at the second line for a long moment. He touched the intervals she'd identified. He nodded once, slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then he looked at Elena. She didn't know what expression was on her face. She had stopped monitoring it somewhere around the moment Grace said it's music. He left the board. He took it back when he left. She'd thought he would leave it, but he picked it up when he went, and she understood. He was going to fix the second line. He was going to come back with a corrected version. This was not a gift in the ordinary sense. It was a project. Harriet waited until he was out the back gate and said, "Well." "Don't," Elena said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were absolutely going to say something." Harriet pressed her lips together in a way that was not quite a smile. "I was going to say that in 19 years of running this boarding house, I've watched people do kind things for other people, and I've learned to recognize the difference between kind and interested." "He's interested in Grace." "He's interested in the problem Grace represents," Harriet said, "and in the person standing next to her." Elena picked up the hem she'd been working on before he arrived. Her hands were not quite steady. "I'm not in a position for that," she said. "Did I suggest you were?" "You were building toward it. I was building toward saying that you've been in Timber Ridge for a month, and you've built a business, and your daughter has made a friend, and a mountain man is staying in my kitchen longer than strictly necessary, and those are not small things." Harriet gathered cups from the table. "I'm not suggesting anything beyond that you notice them." Elena noticed them. That was precisely the problem. The second version of the board came the following Thursday. The second line was corrected. She could see it even without being able to read the notation. There was a regularity to it now that the first hadn't had, and he'd added a third line with 3 levels of marking for the dots. Soft, medium, hard. Grace sat with it for 20 minutes. Elena stayed in the workroom doorway and pretended to examine a collar seam and watched her daughter's hands move across the wood. Adelaide Colton was there that day, and she watched too, with the expression of a child who is witnessing something she doesn't have words for yet. "Can I try?" Adelaide said finally. Grace picked up the board and held it out. Adelaide's hand settled on it uncertainly. "Start at the beginning," Grace said. "Move left to right. Feel the circles first. They're the heartbeat. Everything else happens inside the heartbeat." Adelaide tried. She moved her fingers too fast at first, without listening, and Grace said, "Slower, like you're reading, not rushing." "I'm not a very good reader either," Adelaide said. "That's fine. You're learning the same thing here, just with your hands." Elena had to look away. She looked at Jacob Thorne instead. He was watching the 2 girls at the table with that expression again, the careful, complicated one that she didn't have a word for yet. He looked, she thought, like someone who had given a thing away, and was only now learning how much larger it was than he'd thought. She said quietly, knowing he couldn't hear her, saying it anyway because it needed saying in some direction. Thank you. He turned, and for a moment she thought she'd have to repeat it somehow, signal it. But then she understood he'd been reading her posture, her face, the angle of her body toward his. He'd been reading her the way Grace read a room. He nodded, a single, careful nod. She nodded back. Adelaide Colton carried a new skill home that Thursday without knowing what to call it, and Grace sat up too late that night talking about the intervals, and Harriet left a lamp burning in the kitchen long after she normally extinguished it, and Elena finished the last of her week's work and went to bed and stared at the plaster river in the ceiling and thought, this place is becoming something. She wasn't sure yet what kind of something, but the shape of it was there, forming at the edges, the way the first light on the mountains formed before the sun actually arrived. She slept better than she had since Philadelphia. Then November came, and things got harder. The cold that had seemed like a preliminary became its actual self. The real thing, not an announcement, but an arrival that intended to stay. The mines ran 7 days now because the ore didn't care about the calendar, and the miners came home to their boarding houses and their thin-walled cabins exhausted in a way that had a different texture than ordinary tiredness. Elena saw it in the laundry she repaired, the way the fabric was worn at the knees and the elbows and the collar in patterns that told you what the body had been doing. She saw it in the faces of the women who came to her workroom, who were managing households on too little sleep, and worrying about their men in the shafts in that careful, suppressed way that meant they'd decided worrying openly cost too much. She heard things in those fittings, between the measurements and the pins. Fragments. A foreman named Calder had cut a corner on a support structure in the secondary shaft. Not seriously, or at least not visibly yet, but the men who worked that shaft knew it, and the men who worked that shaft were not the men who got to say anything about it to anyone who could change it. A piece of equipment in the main shaft had been grinding wrong for 6 days, and the request to replace it had gone up to Brennan twice and been deferred twice on grounds of cost. There was a new vein that had been opened 3 weeks ago, deeper than the others, and nobody who worked in it was entirely comfortable with what the walls sounded like in there. But the vein was rich, so. Elena listened to these fragments and said nothing and filed them in the part of her mind that had learned, in a hard childhood and a hard widowhood, to track the difference between trouble that was coming and trouble that had already arrived. She said nothing to anyone directly. She did not know this town well enough to know who to say it to, or if saying it would do anything beyond making her a target for the men who didn't want things said. But she remembered the fragments. Jacob Thorne arrived the first Thursday of November with a 4th version of the board, which had become substantially more complex. He'd added color, actual color, small dabs of paint in red and blue and green that corresponded to something in his system that Elena couldn't parse, but that Grace was decoding with the same systematic patience she brought to everything. He'd also brought, tucked under one arm, a small drum. Not a real drum. A piece of wood stretched with something thin. She thought it was animal skin, finely worked, and set in a frame he'd built, with a surface that was slightly yielding when you pressed it. He set it on the table. He put his hand flat on its surface and looked at Grace. Grace reached out and found it and placed her own palm on the skin. He tapped the board lightly, once. She felt the vibration travel through the drum surface into her hand. She breathed in. He tapped again. A different interval. She breathed differently. He moved into a rhythm. 3 beats, a pause, 2 beats, a pause. And Grace's face did something Elena would carry with her for the rest of her life. It did not become peaceful or transported or whatever the word was that adults use to describe children in moments of discovery. It became concentrated. It became the face of a person encountering a system they'd been waiting for and didn't know they'd been waiting for, and finding it to be exactly as she would have designed it herself. I can hear it, Grace said, but I can also feel it. She pressed her palm harder against the drum skin. In my chest a little. He put his hand on his own chest. He nodded. Yes, I know. Adelaide Colton was there again. She came most Thursdays now. Invited herself with the confidence of a child who has decided something is not optional. And she watched with the quality of attention that Elena was coming to understand as Adelaide's particular gift, the ability to witness something and retain it whole. Can I ask him something? Adelaide said. Elena looked at her. He can't hear. I know. Can you... Is there a way? Elena looked at Jacob Thorne. He was watching Adelaide with that attentive calm, understanding something was being directed at him even without the specific words. "Write it down," Elena said. "He can read." Adelaide thought for a moment. She found a scrap of paper on the work table and picked up the pencil and wrote something in the large, careful letters of a child who'd been taught to write recently enough that the letters were still an achievement rather than a habit. She handed the paper to Jacob Thorne. He read it. Something in his face shifted. Not much, but enough. He looked at Grace. He picked up the pencil and wrote something back and handed the paper to Adelaide, who read it and read it again. "What does it say?" Elena asked. Adelaide held it up. The handwriting was small and economical and completely controlled. The handwriting of someone who'd learned early that you put exactly what was needed and no more. Because the sound was inside her already. "I only made a door." The room was very quiet. Grace was still pressing her palm against the drum, feeling its silence, its potential, the memory of the vibration it had held a moment before. "Read it to me," she said. Adelaide read it. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's true. I always knew it was there." Jacob Thorne looked at Elena again. She had stopped pretending to do anything with the collar in her hands. She said quietly, "Who taught you?" He couldn't hear it, but she said it. He hadn't been born knowing how to build a system for translating sound into touch. Someone had given him something, somewhere, or he'd built it for himself out of necessity, the way people build things when the alternative is going without. Either way, there was a story there that she did not know, and that she found she wanted to know, which was information about herself. She was not entirely sure she was ready to use. Harriet appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at the table with the drum and the board, and the two girls and the mountain man who stayed and said nothing. Elena looked at her. Harriet made her face into an expression of pure innocence that was completely unconvincing and went back to the kitchen. Grace was still feeling the drum. "Will you teach me the whole system?" she said, in the direction she understood Jacob Thorne to be. "The board and the drum together. I want to learn it properly." He picked up the pencil. He wrote on the corner of the same paper. "Yes. Thursday." "Every Thursday," Grace said. He wrote, "Every Thursday." Adelaide Colton looked at the exchange with the expression of someone filing it away for future reference, possibly her entire future reference. Elena suspected Adelaide Colton would remember this moment longer than any of the adults in the room. That night, after Grace slept, Elena sat with the lamp and the collar and thought about what it meant that her daughter was learning music in a way no one had thought to invent before. In a boarding house in a mining town in the Colorado mountains, from a man who lived alone in the trees and had apparently decided, with no discussion and no agreement, that this was a problem he was going to solve. She thought about the second line of the board. The intervals don't match, and how he'd taken it home and corrected it without being asked, without being thanked, and come back the next week with the fix. She thought about the fragments she'd been collecting, the corner cut in the secondary shaft, the equipment grinding wrong for 6 days, the new vein that made the walls sound like something nobody wanted to name. She thought, something is building here, 2 somethings, possibly 3. She didn't know which one would arrive first. Outside, the wind came off the high ridges with its November conviction, and the mountains stood in the dark the way they always stood, enormous and patient and entirely indifferent to what the small warm lights in the valley below were building or failing to build. Elena finished the collar. She turned down the lamp. She went to bed and listened to her daughter breathe. Tomorrow there were 4 fittings and a complicated repair on a coat that had been split along the back seam by a man who apparently hadn't accounted for the growth of his own shoulders. And the week after that, Harriet needed new curtains measured for 2 rooms, and there was money to count and material to order, and a life being assembled piece by piece from what had looked 5 weeks ago like complete rubble. She was still tired. She was still scared in the way that didn't announce itself but simply lived in your chest as a constant low hum. She still didn't know if the ledge she'd found was wide enough to hold everything she needed to build. But Grace had found music. And that was a fact that went somewhere different than the rest of the ledger, somewhere the arithmetic didn't quite reach, and Elena let herself have it without examining it until it fell apart. She slept. The grinding sound had been there for 9 days when Elena finally said something. She said it to Harriet, which was not the same as saying it to anyone who could act on it, but Harriet knew this town in ways Elena hadn't yet earned, and sometimes knowing who to tell was more valuable than knowing what to say. The equipment in the main shaft, Elena said. She was at the work table. Her hands kept moving because stopping her hands made her feel like she was losing ground. I've heard it mentioned 3 times now. Different women, different days. They all stop themselves mid-sentence like they've said more than they meant to. Harriet was at the stove. She didn't turn around immediately. Which equipment? The lift mechanism, the one that brings the ore cages up. A pause. The stove made its sounds. Brennan knows about it, Harriet said. He's deferred the repair twice. I know that too. Harriet turned now, and her face had a quality Elena recognized. The expression of someone who has been holding a concern at a careful distance and has just been asked to bring it closer. How do you know that? Dorothy Harding. She didn't mean to tell me. She was talking about something else, and it came out at the edge of a sentence, and then she caught it and stopped. Harriet sat down across from Elena. This was unusual. Harriet did not normally sit during the day. She moved through her hours with a purposeful efficiency that made sitting feel like something she'd scheduled for later. The men in that shaft know, Harriet said. They've known for 2 weeks, but the mine pays their rent and their food and their children's shoes, and nobody's found a way to make those things come from somewhere else yet. Someone should tell Brennan directly. In writing, something he can't defer. You'd be surprised what a man in that position can defer. Then someone should tell whoever Brennan answers to. Harriet looked at her carefully. The Caldwell operation is owned by a man named Silas Caldwell, who lives in Denver and comes to Timber Ridge twice a year to look at numbers. He's due in February. February? Elena said. February, Harriet confirmed. Elena looked at the seam she was running. Her needle moved in and out with the automatic precision of something her hands had been doing for 20 years without requiring her full attention. February was 3 months away, which was 3 months of the lift mechanism grinding in ways that made experienced miners go quiet when their wives asked how the day had gone. She didn't say anything else about it that evening. But she didn't stop thinking about it either, and thinking about it sat in her chest alongside everything else she was carrying and made the weight a specific rather than a general thing. Jacob came that Thursday. He came earlier than usual, mid-morning instead of mid-afternoon, and he didn't have a carving. He had the drum, which he'd been leaving at the boarding house since the second lesson, and he had a new version of the board that he set on the kitchen table without ceremony. Then he sat down across from where Grace would sit, and he waited. Grace came in from the hallway where she'd been helping Harriet sort linens. She'd developed a system for identifying fabric by texture and weight that Harriet had adopted without comment as simply a faster method than her own. And she found the chair across from Jacob by the sound of it being pulled out and the particular quality of his presence in the room, which she had described to Elena once as heavier than most people but not loud about it. They worked for 2 hours. Elena stayed in the workroom doorway for a lot of it, not pretending to do something else this time, but simply watching, because she had decided that pretending was costing her more than it was worth. What Jacob had built, and it was more complete now, more genuinely itself, was not something she could have named before she watched Grace use it. It was a way of encoding rhythm and tone and dynamics in marks that could be read with the fingertips, and he had built it with no model because no model existed. He had invented it from the inside out, the way you invented something when you started from what a specific person needed and worked outward rather than starting from what already existed and trying to adapt it. It was imperfect. Grace found its imperfections the way she found everything, systematically, without drama, and she communicated them back to him through a combination of hand gestures they'd developed between them and, occasionally, writing on a shared scrap of paper. He received her corrections with the same composed attention he brought to everything. No defensiveness. No need to have gotten it right the first time. He would look at what she'd identified, turn it over in his hands or his mind, and then nod or write back. Adelaide Colton had begun arriving on Thursday mornings rather than afternoons. Her mother Margaret had mentioned this to Elena with the particular expression of a woman who is slightly puzzled by her own child. She wakes up on Thursdays like it's a holiday, Margaret had said. I don't know what's happened to her. Adelaide was at this table now, watching Jacob and Grace work, with a second pencil and a second piece of paper on which she was attempting to reproduce the notation she was watching. She was getting it partially right, which Elena gathered was better than Jacob had gotten it on his first attempt at his own system. The green means held, not loud, Grace said, not looking up from the board. You've been reading it as loud. Adelaide looked at her paper. How do you know what I'm reading? Because you tapped your finger twice just now on the third circle, and that's a loud interpretation, not a held one. The color changes the meaning, not the weight. Adelaide stared at her. I can't decide if that's amazing or terrifying. Both, probably, Grace said. Jacob had been watching this exchange with that expression again. Elena caught his eye across the room, across the kitchen doorway, through the noise of the workroom and the sounds of the house. And he looked at her with something that was not quite a smile and not quite anything. She had a standard name for, and she looked back with something similar, and it lasted exactly long enough to be a thing before she returned to the blouse in her hands. She was running out of ways to tell herself this wasn't anything. The second week of November, Margaret Colton came for a fitting and stayed longer than necessary. Elena noticed Margaret had the habit, when she was working up to something, of finding small tasks to occupy her hands while her mind assembled whatever she needed to say. She straightened a bolt of fabric on the edge shelf. She re-examined a button sample she'd already examined. She asked about Adelaide's Thursday attendance in a way that suggested Adelaide wasn't the point. Elena waited. Finally, my husband told me something last night. Elena kept her eyes on her work. All right. He came home and sat down and didn't eat, which he never does, and then he told me the lift cable has a fray. The needle stopped. A fray, Elena said. In the main cable, the one that runs the ore cage on the primary shaft. Margaret's voice was careful, the carefulest voice Elena had heard from her. He said it's been there for a while, small at first. Now it's not small. How long has Brennan known? A silence that was itself an answer. James filed a report 10 days ago, Margaret said, meaning her husband. In writing, to Brennan's office. Elena said, And he was told the equipment was scheduled for inspection in the new year and that in the meantime, the load limits would be adjusted. Margaret's hands had gone still. James thinks the load limit adjustment has been followed for approximately 4 days. After that, the pace picks back up because the ore doesn't care about load limits. Elena looked at her. Margaret was not a woman who scared easily. You couldn't be. Married to a man who went underground every day and came back covered in things that weren't supposed to be on the surface. But she was scared now, and she was here telling Elena, and Elena understood what that meant. Margaret didn't know what to do with it. She'd come to put it somewhere outside herself because it was too heavy to carry alone without doing something with it. Who owns the cable? Elena asked. Caldwell Operation. And Caldwell is in Denver until February. That's right. Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about the women who'd stopped their sentences, the fragments she'd been filing, the grinding for 9 days and then no more grinding because the sound had changed. Dorothy Harding had mentioned that. The sound had changed 2 days ago, and changed sounds in mine equipment were generally worse than consistent sounds. Margaret, Elena said, does James have a copy of the report he filed? He kept one. He should keep it somewhere that isn't the house. Margaret looked at her. You think something's going to happen? Elena looked at the blouse in her hands. The seam was even and good. The fabric was a decent wool that had been well cared for. Ordinary, functional, built to last. I think, Elena said carefully, that there are a lot of men going into a shaft every day, and not all of them will know what James knows, and not all of them have wives who are as careful as you. Margaret was quiet. Then, what do I do? I don't know yet, but keep the copy. And if James can talk to the other men, quietly, without making it a confrontation, he should know that he's not the only one who's noticed. Margaret left an hour later. Her fitting was incomplete, but neither of them mentioned it. Elena sat down at the work table after she'd gone and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Outside the window, the mountains were close and white and giving nothing away. She thought about Brennan's face when he'd come to the boarding house, the hat turning in his hands. I came to apologize. She thought about the way he ran the operation, like a fine watch, Harriet had said, efficient, functional. But a watch that was reading the numbers correctly could still have a spring that was winding too tight, and the man who owned the watch sometimes didn't see that because the numbers were still right, and he'd gotten used to the sound. She thought about Jacob Thorne sitting at Harriet's kitchen table with a child who couldn't see and teaching her to feel music through wood and paint and a drum skin stretched over a frame he'd made himself. She thought about what it meant to build something for a specific person, starting from what they needed. Not from what was convenient, not from what was standard, from what the actual person in front of you required. She picked up her needle. She went back to work. But something had shifted in her understanding of how the next weeks were going to go, and she didn't like the shape of it. It happened on a Thursday, which was the day Jacob came, which meant he was in Harriet's kitchen when the sound rolled through the mountain at 10 minutes past 9 in the morning. A sound that was less like an explosion in the ordinary sense and more like the earth clearing its throat, a deep, compressed concussion that Elena felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears, that rattled the lamp on the work table and sent a cup off Harriet's kitchen shelf and brought Grace upright from the chair where she'd been waiting for Jacob to set up the board. Then the bell. The mine bell was for emergencies only. Everyone in Timber Ridge knew this. It had rung twice in the 11 years it had been there, and both times people had died. It rang now with a flat, serious insistence, and within 60 seconds, Elena could hear the town responding. Voices, running feet, doors. The particular quality of a community pivoting from its ordinary morning toward something it had always known might come. She was already at the back door. Jacob was on his feet. He hadn't heard the explosion or the bell, but he'd felt the concussion. She could tell from the way he'd stood, fast, his hand on the table, his face recalibrated in a direction that was entirely different from Thursday lessons. He looked at Elena. She pointed toward the mine. She mouthed the word, and then, because mouthing it wasn't enough, she grabbed the pencil from the table and wrote in the largest letters she could manage on the corner of the lesson paper, "Mine. Explosion." He read it in half a second. He was at the back door before she'd set the pencil down. "Mama." Grace was standing in the middle of the kitchen, both hands slightly raised, reading the room. Something happened. "Stay with Harriet," Elena said. "What happened?" "I don't know yet. Stay with Harriet." "I'm not staying with Harriet." Elena looked at her. There was no point arguing this. She knew Grace's voice at that pitch, and she knew that pitch meant the argument was already lost. "Then stay near me," she said, "and do exactly what I say the moment I say it." "Yes," Grace said, simply, immediately. She reached out and found Elena's arm, and they went. The main shaft head was 3/4 of a mile from Harriet's boarding house, up a grade that became steep in the last 100 yards. And Elena was not the only one running it. The whole town seemed to be converging, women with their coats half-buttoned, men from the secondary shifts still in their sleep clothes, children who'd gotten out ahead of people trying to keep them back. The morning was cold and sharp, and the smoke was visible before they were close enough to see its source, a dirty brown column rising from somewhere below the shaft head that meant fire in the tunnels and not enough air moving to clear it. Jacob had pulled ahead. She'd expected that. He moved differently than other men, with a kind of ground-covering efficiency that didn't look fast from a distance but got there before you thought it would. He reached the shaft head 40 seconds before Elena and Grace, and by the time Elena arrived, he was already in a conversation, his own kind of conversation, the kind that didn't use words, with one of the younger miners who'd been on surface duty and had seen what happened. The miner was scared and talking fast, and Jacob was watching his hands and his face with complete attention, gathering what he could. Elena got there, and the miner turned to her because she was a person who could respond verbally, and he said it all again, and she listened. The primary shaft lift had failed. The frayed cable, the one James Colton had filed a report about, the one Brennan had scheduled for inspection in the new year, had given way at the drum housing. The ore cage had dropped 6 levels. There were men on that cage and men in the upper tunnels, and a fire had started somewhere in the second level from a lamp being knocked in the fall, and there were 31 men underground. 31. Elena turned to Jacob. She didn't have paper. She didn't have a pencil. She looked at him, and he was already looking at her with the attentiveness of someone who understood that information was being conveyed and was working to collect all of it he could. She held up 3 fingers, then 1 finger, then she pointed down. He looked at the shaft head, back at her. He nodded. She made a fire gesture, fingers spreading up from a palm. He nodded again. His jaw had tightened. He turned back to the shaft head, taking stock of what was there, the equipment, the structure, the people, how they were organized, what they were doing, and what they were failing to do. What they were failing to do was the main thing. The men on the surface were gathered in the particular cluster that forms when people understand that something requires action but haven't yet decided who acts and how. There were too many voices. There were 3 men trying to operate the backup hand crank mechanism simultaneously, which meant none of them were operating it effectively. Someone was calling for rope, and someone else had rope, but in the wrong place. Jacob moved. He didn't announce himself. He walked to the 3 men on the hand crank and separated them with his hands. Not roughly, but with a definite, specific pressure that communicated clarity, and put the strongest looking of the 3 at the crank position and placed the other 2 at the stabilization points. He pointed at the crank. He mimicked the motion. He stepped back. The man at the crank looked uncertain. Jacob looked at him with an expression that contained no uncertainty whatsoever. The man started cranking. The backup mechanism engaged with a grinding complaint that suggested it hadn't been exercised recently, but it engaged, and that was the difference between something and nothing. Grace had her hand on Elena's arm and was listening with the focused, total quality that Elena recognized as her daughter, taking in every available input. "How many men?" she said. 31 underground. We don't know how many on the cage." "The fire's in the 2nd level," Grace said. "Yes." "Then the men who went down before the shift change, they'd be below the fire. The fire is between them and the exit." Elena looked at her. "I heard the shift bell at 6 and the 2nd bell at 8, Grace said. "There's usually a 3rd crew that goes down at 9, but that's the one that would have been on the cage when it went." She paused. "I count sounds. I know the mind sounds." Elena stared at her daughter and then did what Grace had done to her on Brennan's porch. She turned and looked for someone to tell this to. Thomas Brennan arrived running. She had never seen him run before. It did something to his authority that she hadn't expected. It made him look, briefly, like everyone else. Like a man who was scared and moving fast toward a thing that was his responsibility and had gone wrong. He arrived at the shaft head still buttoning his coat, and his face was doing the thing that Harriet had described, the calculation, always the calculation. But it was running fast and hot now, not the cold arithmetic of the street, but the desperate kind. He saw Elena. He stopped for half a second. She said, "The men below the fire, the ones who went down before 6 and were down at 8. They're below the 2nd level, below where the fire is." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. "Grace calculated the shifts by the bells," Elena said. "She's been counting the mind sounds since we arrived." Brennan's face went through something complicated and fast. Then, the north access. There's a secondary passage from the north face. If the fire's only in the 2nd level and the ventilation is pulling east, the north access might still be passable. How do you get to the north access? You go around the ridge. It's longer. The entrance is in the trees on the north side, half-mile up. Jacob Thorne was there. Elena didn't explain it. She didn't have the tools to explain it quickly enough. She looked at Brennan and said, "Can he access the north passage? Alone? Will he be able to understand the structure?" Brennan looked at Jacob. Jacob looked at Brennan. 2 men reading each other without the mediation of words. Brennan pointed north. He held up his hand in the shape of a tunnel, one hand making the arch, the other indicating the interior. He held up fingers. 3 levels down, the men would be at the 3rd level or below. Jacob watched. He nodded. Brennan looked uncertain, not about the information, but about the decision. Sending one man alone into a compromised mine was a decision he would carry regardless of what happened. "He builds things alone in the mountains," Elena said quietly. "He knows structure. He knows what holds and what doesn't." Brennan looked at her, then back at Jacob. He nodded. Jacob turned and ran, and Elena watched him disappear around the base of the ridge at that ground-covering pace, and she had the complicated, specific feeling of having sent something into danger that she did not have the right to call hers, and which she had sent anyway. Then she turned to what was in front of her. The surface was organized chaos at best, and pure chaos at worst. The men on the hand crank were making progress, which meant someone might be able to come up the shaft if the fire allowed it, but there were injured men already. 2 who'd been working at the shaft head when the cable went had been hit by debris, one significantly. There was a foreman's wife who had medical knowledge that no one had thought to use yet. There were supplies in the mining office that no one had organized. Elena organized them. She moved through the chaos with the focused calm of someone who had been managing limited resources under pressure for years and had learned that panic was a cost she couldn't afford. She found the woman with medical knowledge, Ruth Marsh, whose father had been a field surgeon in the war, and brought her to the injured men. She found the supplies in the mining office and established a place to put them. She tore 2 work shirts into lengths for wrapping because the bandaging available was inadequate. She sent Adelaide Colton's mother, who had arrived at a run with Adelaide beside her, back to gather blankets from every boarding house within reach. And Margaret went without argument because being given a task that had a clear shape was better than standing in the cold with nothing to do but be afraid. Grace stayed at Elena's shoulder through all of it. She was not in the way. That was the thing Elena kept noting, kept being surprised by, even though she should have stopped being surprised by anything her daughter did. Grace moved through the space at the shaft head with a quietness and accuracy that meant she was never where the wrong thing was about to happen. She could hear the hand crank mechanism, and she knew when it was straining and when it was moving freely, and she said so once, clearly, and the minute the crank adjusted their grip and the mechanism moved more freely, and one of the younger miners looked at her with an expression that had no category for what he was seeing. "How do you know that?" he said. "The pitch changes when the gearing slips," Grace said. "If you hold it with both hands evenly, it compensates for the weight distribution." He stared at her. Then he put both hands evenly on the crank. The mechanism turned smoother. Ruth Marsh was working on the more seriously injured man, and a possible break in the smaller bones of the wrist, from what Elena could see. And she was good, competent, and quick. And Elena stayed beside her and handed things and applied pressure when told, and did not think about what was happening half a mile north in a dark tunnel with a man who couldn't hear the mountain if it started talking. She thought about it anyway. She couldn't help that. An hour and 20 minutes after the explosion, the first men came up the shaft, 6 of them, from the cage. They'd been below the drop point of the cage, not on it, and they'd climbed 2 levels in smoke with their coats over their faces and made it to the hand crank level. They came up one at a time, coughing, and 3 of them couldn't stand without help, and 2 of them were asking about men who hadn't come up yet, saying names. Elena kept track of the names. She borrowed a pencil from the mining office, and she wrote on the back of a manifest sheet every name that was said to her. Men still below, men accounted for, men whose last known position was uncertain. She wrote them clearly, and she kept the list, and when Brennan came to her 40 minutes into the effort, she handed it to him without being asked. He looked at it, then at her. "How people talk," she said. "I wrote it down." He looked at the list again. 15 names in the still below column, 8 in the accounted for column, 8 more in the uncertain column. "This is more than my own count," he said. "I talked to more people than you did," she said. "I've been here the whole time." He had the expression he'd worn on his step that day. The recalculation, but softer now, running in a different direction. He didn't say anything. He took the list and went back to the shaft head. 2 hours after the explosion, Grace straightened. She'd been sitting on a crate near the shaft head access, listening with that total attention, and she'd been so still for so long that people had started to move around her without quite seeing her, the way you stop seeing a fixture that's always been there. But now she straightened and she turned her face north and she said, "Mama." Elena was there in 2 steps. "What?" "I can hear something." "From the shaft?" "No, from the north." A pause. Her head tilted. "Tapping. 3 beats, a pause. 2 beats. Elena looked north. The tree line on the north ridge was half a mile away and uphill, and there was nothing visible at its edge. She heard nothing. 3 and 2, Grace said again. "It's regular. It's a signal." Elena turned to Brennan. "She says she can hear a tapping signal from the north. 3 beats, 2 beats. Repeating." Brennan stared at her. "That's the standard mine signal for all clear with men present." Elena looked at Grace. "It's coming closer," Grace said. "The sound is getting louder slowly." She paused. "They're moving. They're coming out." The first figure emerged from the tree line 8 minutes later. Jacob Thorne came out first, which was what Elena had expected without knowing she'd expected it. He came out walking, not running, which told her his body was intact if nothing else. Behind him were men. 6, 7, 8, she counted, while her heart did something unscheduled in her chest. Coming out of the trees in a line, most moving under their own power, some with arms around the men beside them. 12 men total. From the 3rd level, where the fire couldn't reach and the shaft had been. The town made a sound. It wasn't a cheer, not exactly. It was something more raw than that, The sound of people who have been holding a very specific fear and have had it removed suddenly and haven't found a better container for that feeling yet. Wives who'd been silent for 2 hours went toward the tree line, and children followed, and the ordered chaos around the shaft head became briefly a different kind of chaos, the kind that doesn't require managing. Jacob walked through it with the same composed certainty he walked through everything. He was dirty, and his coat had a tear along the left shoulder, and there was something dark on his right hand that Elena told herself was only grime and possibly believed. He came directly to where Elena was standing, with Grace beside her. He stopped in front of them. His face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing she'd spent 2 months trying to name. But there was something more in it now, something that had been put through a different kind of heat and had come out changed. Grace said, "You used the signal." He looked at her. He reached into his coat and found the scrap of paper he always carried and the pencil stub and wrote and showed her, and Elena read over Grace's shoulder. "You taught me. 3 and 2. Grace was quiet for a moment. "I only taught you the notation." He wrote again. "Same thing." Elena looked at him. Her throat was doing things she wasn't going to talk about now, not here, not in the middle of this. She looked at his right hand and she looked at the tear in his coat and she said, "Are you hurt?" He looked at his hand as if he'd forgotten it was there. He shook his head. She didn't believe him entirely, but she was standing in the middle of a rescue that wasn't finished yet, and she couldn't follow it further than that right now. She looked at Brennan, who had arrived at Jacob's shoulder and was counting the men from the tree line with the fast, focused arithmetic of a man who knows exactly how many there should be. 12, Brennan said. He'd expected 9. He looked at Jacob with an expression that was entirely different from the expression he'd worn at any other point in Elena's experience of him. It was not the careful, managing face. It was something underneath that face, something that had been there longer and had been used less. "How?" Brennan said. Jacob couldn't hear the question, but he understood it from Brennan's face, and he made a gesture, his hands spreading out, indicating the tunnel, the structure, then coming together in a shape that meant I followed the walls. Then he pointed to his feet. He'd felt his way through the structure, the same way Grace felt music, through contact, through what the surface was telling him. Brennan stared at him for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Jacob looked at it. He reached out and shook it. Not the performative shake of men who want to be seen shaking hands. The kind that happens when neither person has anything else to say and the hand is the only sufficient language. Elena looked at Grace. Grace was facing toward the mountain, her head slightly tilted, still listening, still cataloging, already filing away the sounds and textures of this morning in whatever architecture she used to understand the world. "Mama," she said, "I know." "Is everyone out?" "Not yet, but more than we thought." Elena put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. "More than we thought." The afternoon continued its hard work. The fire in the second level burned out by midday, contained, as it turned out, by a natural break in the ventilation that nobody had counted on, but everyone was grateful for. 4 more men came up the primary shaft in the early afternoon as the smoke cleared. One man was badly hurt, and Ruth Marsh worked on him for 2 hours with Elena beside her, and he was alive when the light began to go from the sky. By evening, the count was 30 of 31. The 31st was found at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, alive, in a side gallery where he'd sealed himself in with his coat pressed against the gap when the smoke came. He'd done it without being trained for it, out of some instinct or luck or stubbornness. He came up the shaft coughing and trembling and then sat down on the cold ground and couldn't be moved for 20 minutes. His name was Owen Carr. He was 22 years old. He didn't know yet what had saved him. Harriet arrived at some point in the mid-afternoon with food. Not asked, not organized, just Harriet, carrying things because that was what Harriet did with a crisis. She fed it. She found Elena and pressed something into her hands and said nothing and went back to feed the next person. By the time the light was fully gone and the emergency had moved into its aftermath phase, the organized grief and accounting that follows disaster when the immediate danger has passed, Elena found herself sitting on the same crate Grace had used earlier, her hands in her lap, aware for the first time in hours of how tired she was. Jacob sat down beside her. Not close. An appropriate distance, the kind that didn't announce anything, that left room for the other person to decide what it meant. They sat in the dark at the top of the mine grade, and the town made its quieting sounds around them. And after a while, Jacob reached into his coat and produced the pencil stub and wrote something on the back of his hand where she could see it, since there was no paper immediately available. He showed her his hand. In the bad light, she had to lean slightly to read it. You kept count. She looked at her own hands. The pencil marks were still on her fingers from the list she'd made. She looked at his words written on his skin. Somebody had to, she said, knowing he couldn't hear it. But he was watching her face, and she thought he caught enough of it. Grace found them by sound and settled on the crate beside Elena and leaned against her the way she did when she was tired but didn't want to say so. And Elena put her arm around her daughter, and the three of them sat at the top of the mine grade while Timber Ridge sorted through what the day had given it and what it had taken. The frayed cable was gone. The 31st man was alive in the mining office, wrapped in Harriet's blankets. Jacob's coat had a tear that would need mending, and she would do it, and she would look at his hand when she did to see how badly it was hurt. None of it was over, she knew that. The accounting would come, for the equipment, for the deferred reports, for the man who had made those deferrals. And the town would have to live in the aftermath of this day for a long time, longer than the cold, longer than the winter. But 30 of 31 was not 31 of 31, and that gap was made of something she had helped build, something Harriet had helped build, something Grace had built with her ears and her careful counting, and something Jacob Thorne had built alone in the dark of a mountain with his hands on the walls. She was too tired to name what that meant. She was not too tired to know it meant something. The days after the explosion had a particular texture that Elena hadn't encountered before. Not the texture of grief exactly, though grief was in it, and not the texture of relief, though that was in it too. It was more like the feeling of a room after a very loud sound has stopped. Everything was technically the same as before, but the air held the memory of the noise, and people moved through it differently, and the silence that came after was not the comfortable kind. Timber Ridge counted itself. This was what communities did after something like this, Elena was learning. They counted their living and their injured and their intact, and they found the number and they held it. And the number 30 of 31 became a thing that people said to each other in the street with the particular weight of a figure that could have been different. Owen Carr, the 22-year-old who'd sealed himself in the side gallery, was walking around by the third day, thinner and quieter, but walking. And people touched his arm when they passed him like they needed to verify he was still solid. The primary shaft was closed. This was not a decision that required debate. The cable housing had to be replaced, and the second level had to be cleared and assessed. And the Colorado Mine Inspection Board was sending 2 men from Denver who would arrive in a week and whose arrival Thomas Brennan was preparing for with the specific dread of a man who understood exactly how much of what they would find was attributable to his own decisions. Elena knew this because Harriet knew everything, and Harriet knew this because Dorothy Harding had stopped being careful about what she said in front of her. And Dorothy Harding had stopped being careful because the day after the explosion, she'd sat in Harriet's kitchen and cried without apology for 20 minutes and said, "James Colton filed that report. My husband knew he filed that report. We all knew, and none of us said it to the right person." "You didn't know something would happen," Harriet said. "We knew something could," Dorothy said. "That's the part that's the same." Elena had been in the workroom doorway and heard this and said nothing because there was nothing to add to it that would help. The morning after the explosion, she had mended Jacob's coat. He'd brought it to the back door early, before the Thursday lesson, before Grace was even up, and she'd taken it from him and examined the tear, which ran along the left shoulder seam and then angled down into the back panel, the kind of tear that happened when something caught on a rough edge and the wearer kept moving without stopping for it. Structural rather than surface damage. She'd have to take the shoulder seam apart and reset it. She looked at his hand. He hadn't volunteered it. But when she looked, he turned his palm up, which she chose to read as permission. The right palm had 3 cuts, none deep enough to be serious, all of them in the pattern of someone who'd braced repeatedly against rough stone in the dark. She cleaned them with carbolic and wrapped the worst one without speaking, and he sat at Harriet's kitchen table and let her do it with the stillness he brought to most things. And when she finished, she didn't let go of his hand immediately. She didn't plan for that to happen. She was simply there, holding his hand on the kitchen table, and then she was aware that she was doing it and set it down carefully. He didn't react to this, which was either because he hadn't noticed or because he had the quality, which she'd observed in him since the beginning, of receiving information without immediately doing something with it. He let things land and then considered them on his own time. She went back to the coat. He watched her work for a while. Then he picked up the pencil and wrote on the edge of the kitchen newspaper Harriet left out each morning. "How is Grace?" "She's fine," Elena said. "She slept well, which is more than I did." He wrote, "She knew before anyone. She counted the shift bells. She's been doing it since we arrived." Elena pulled a thread taut. "She does that with everything. Files it away. I never know when it's going to turn out to matter." He was quiet for a moment. His version of quiet. The pencil at rest. His hands still. Then he wrote, "I heard them. Below the 3rd level. I couldn't have found them without the structure knowledge. But I heard them because I felt the walls." Elena looked up from the coat. "You felt them through the walls." He nodded. He wrote, "The same way she felt the drum. The vibration travels differently when there's a person at the end of it." She looked at him for a long moment. He had gone into a burning mine through a back entrance alone and navigated 3 levels of a compromised structure in the dark by feeling the walls with his hands, and he was describing it to her in terms of Grace's drum lessons. She didn't know what to do with that except look at it. "You could have not come back," she said. She said it quietly and directly, because those were the only ways she knew how to say things that mattered. He read her lips, or her face, or the particular quality of the moment, and he understood enough to write, "Same is true of everyone in that mountain." "Not the same," Elena said. He looked at her. She looked back. The kitchen was warm and smelled of Harriet's early bread, and the carbolic she'd used on his hand, and the particular smell of his coat, which was wood smoke and pine and cold air. And the morning was coming through the window in the unremarkable way mornings came through windows. And Elena thought, "There is something happening here that I have been refusing to look at, and I am going to have to stop refusing." She went back to the coat. He went back to waiting for Grace. The inspection team arrived from Denver 6 days after the explosion. 2 men named Alcott and Price, who wore city coats and carried leather cases, and had the expression of people who spent their professional lives looking at things that should have been addressed sooner. They went through the shaft head and the lift mechanism and the documentation, and they spoke with Brennan in the mining office for 4 hours on the first day, and the door was closed for all 4 hours, and what came out at the end of it was not immediately public but moved through Timber Ridge in the particular way that information moved through small towns. Not announced, simply known. Brennan had deferred the cable inspection twice. The written record confirmed it. James Colton's report was in the file. The load limit adjustment had been documented, but the subsequent returns to normal load had not been, which meant the documentation showed compliance, and the shaft told a different story. Price, the senior inspector, came to see Elena. She hadn't expected this. He arrived at Harriet's boarding house on the second afternoon of the inspection and knocked at the front door and asked, with professional courtesy, if she was the woman who had kept the accounting during the rescue. She said she was. He asked if he could see the list. She had kept it. Not because she'd planned to need it, she'd planned to throw it away when it was over, when the men were counted and the emergency was past. But she hadn't thrown it away, partly from the habit of not discarding things that had cost something to produce, and partly from some instinct that she hadn't examined yet about what the list was and what it might need to be. She gave it to Price. He read it slowly, turning the manifest sheet over, reading both sides. "You cross-reference the names from multiple sources," he said. "I talked to everyone who would talk to me," Elena said. "I wrote down what they said. There are annotations here, next to some names. People said things while they were saying the names. I wrote those down too." He looked at her over the paper. "This one. Calder. Secondary shaft corner, R. Marsh husband confirms, 3 weeks. What does that mean?" Elena folded her hands. She had thought about this moment, or something like it. She had thought about whether she was the right person to say the things she'd heard in fittings and consultations and the margins of other conversations said to her because she was the seamstress, because seamstresses were furniture, because women talked to other women in the assumption that the information went nowhere. She thought about Dorothy Harding crying in Harriet's kitchen. "We knew something could." "It means," Elena said, "that a foreman named Calder cut a support corner in the secondary shaft approximately 3 weeks before the explosion. I heard it mentioned in 3 separate conversations by women whose husbands worked that shaft. I don't know if it's directly relevant to what happened, but I thought someone should know that it had been said." Price looked at the annotation for a long time. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "would you be willing to write down, formally, Everything you observed and heard in the period before the explosion? Not just the rescue, the weeks before. Elena looked at him. Would it be used? It would be part of the inspection record. That's not what I asked. A pause. It would be available to the Caldwell ownership and to the board. What they use it for is their decision. But suppressing it is not a decision I'm permitted to make. She said she would write it. She did it that evening, at the work table, with the lamp turned up. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote it in the same plain, specific language she used for everything. Not accusatory, not embellished, just precise. What was said, by whom, in what context, on what date. The grinding equipment, the deferred report, the load limits, the corner in the secondary shaft, the change in sound 2 days before the explosion that Dorothy Harding had mentioned and then stopped mentioning. She wrote it all down. Then she wrote down what Jacob had done. She wrote it in the same plain language, but she found that plainness was the right register for it. The facts were enough, the facts were more than enough, and adding anything to them would only diminish what they already carried. Jacob Thorne, woodcarver, resident at the North Tree Line, proceeded to the secondary north access alone, navigated 3 underground levels in compromised conditions, and brought 12 men out through the north exit. He did this without being asked, without pay, and without acknowledgement from the mine operation. He is deaf and cannot speak. He navigated by physical contact with the walls. She looked at that paragraph for a while. Then she folded the paper and sealed it and left it with Harriet to give to Price in the morning. She sat with her hands empty for a long time afterward. The weight of the weeks since Philadelphia. Not the specific events, but the accumulated weight of being new somewhere and building something and being afraid and keeping the fear at a functional level while still doing what needed doing, settled on her in a way it hadn't been allowed to while the doing was still happening. Now there was a gap, and it came in and she sat with it, and she was very tired, and also, underneath the tiredness, something else that she had been circling without landing on. She was still here. Not in the narrow sense of surviving the explosion, because she'd been on the surface. In the larger sense, she was still in Timber Ridge. She had 16 customers, and a workroom, and a daughter who had made a friend and learned music and counted mine shift bells with the same systematic patience she brought to everything. She had a woman named Harriet who left food on her work table without being asked. She had a town that had watched her work through a crisis and had filed it somewhere in the accounting of who she was. She was still here, and the place had stopped being foreign in the specific way that new places are foreign, where every surface is unfamiliar and every face is a stranger, and you hold yourself slightly apart from everything because you haven't yet learned which parts are yours. Some of this place was starting to feel like hers. She didn't know whether to trust that feeling. She'd trusted a feeling before. The feeling that Thomas Brennan's letters were the letters of a man who meant what he said, and she knew what that cost. Feelings were not evidence. Feelings were the stories you told yourself about the evidence, and sometimes the story was wrong. But she was still here, and that was itself a kind of evidence. Brennan came to the boarding house on the 4th day of the inspection. He didn't come to the front door this time. He came around to Harriet's kitchen entrance, which Elena gathered was itself a statement of something, a decision about how he wanted to present himself for whatever this conversation was going to be. Harriet let him in, and then removed herself with a skill that Elena had come to recognize as Harriet's form of tact. He sat down across from Elena at the kitchen table. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept well in 4 days, which was fair because 4 days ago 31 men had been in his mine when the cable went. "They found Calder's Corner," he said. Elena said nothing. "I didn't know about Calder's Corner," Brennan said. "I want to be clear about that. What I did know about was the cable. And I made decisions about the cable that I—" He stopped, looked at his hands on the table. "I made decisions about the cable that I would not make again." "I know," Elena said. "You wrote it down. For the inspection record." "Yes." A pause. "I'm not here to ask you to change it." "Good," Elena said, "because I wouldn't." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted into something she hadn't seen from him before. Not the management face, not the calculation. Something plainer and less comfortable. "The list you kept," he said, "during the rescue. The names. What about it?" "You talked to the women," he said. "You talked to everyone. You walked through that whole scene and talked to everyone who had information and wrote it down and gave it to me when I needed it. A pause. I was running the operation. I should have known who was where underground. I had a partial list. You had a better one. I've been talking to the women of this town since I arrived, Elena said. You work with the men. The men don't always tell you the same things the women tell each other. I know that, he said. I know that, and I've known it, and I've never done anything with knowing it. Elena looked at him carefully. What are you saying, Mr. Brennan? He sat with the question for a moment. He was not a man who rushed his answers. She'd known that about him since the first day, and it was one of the things she'd respected, even when she'd hated everything else about him. The secondary shaft is going to reopen in 6 weeks, maybe 8, he said. The primary will take longer, and Caldwell is coming in February, which means I have 6 to 8 weeks to show the operation is rebuilding soundly before the man who owns it arrives to decide whether it continues under my management. He looked at her. I want to know what the men's families know. On a regular basis. Not gossip, condition. What the equipment sounds like. What the men come home saying. What changes when something's wrong that I might not hear from inside the operation. Elena looked at him for a long time. You're asking me to be a source, she said. I'm asking you to let me pay you for information that helps keep men alive, he said. You're in a position to hear things I'm not. You've shown that. And when the information is about you? A silence. Then I need to hear that most of all, he said. He said it without flinching from it, which cost him something. She could see that, and she gave him credit for it even while she reserved her answer. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. He stood. He moved toward the door and then stopped, his hand on the frame, and said without turning, what your daughter said to me, on the street, the first day. Elena waited. She was right, he said. I couldn't see. He paused. I'm not sure I see better now, but I know what I was missing, which is a start. He left. Elena sat at Harriet's kitchen table and looked at the door and thought about what it meant when a man who'd called your daughter a burden showed up in a kitchen to acknowledge it. Not enough. Not close to enough. On its own. But not nothing either. She was a practical woman. Nothing was not nothing. Jacob came that Thursday as always, and the lesson resumed as if the mine hadn't exploded, and he hadn't navigated 3 levels of burning dark to bring 12 men out. He set the board on the table, he set the drum beside it, he sat down across from Grace and waited. Grace sat down and put her hands on the board. You changed this, she said immediately. He had. He'd added a 4th line to the notation, something new, something Elena hadn't seen in the previous versions. Grace traced it slowly. These are rests, Grace said. You've been putting rests between sections but not notating them separately. Now you're giving them their own mark. He waited. The silence is part of it, Grace said. You're saying the silence counts. He picked up the pencil. He wrote, You said that to me once, 2 months ago, that the silence between beats is where the beat lives. I said that? He wrote, You were explaining to Adelaide why she was rushing. Grace was quiet for a moment, her hands still on the board. I didn't know I knew that. He wrote, You know a lot of things you don't know you know. Elena was standing in the workroom doorway again, not pretending to do anything else. She watched her daughter's face process this, the small, particular expression Grace wore when something external confirmed something she'd been carrying internally without knowing she was carrying it, that expression of quiet, private recognition. Adelaide Colton arrived 20 minutes into the lesson with a scarf wrapped 3 times around her neck against the November cold and a look of deep annoyance. My mother made me finish my sums first, she announced, sitting down hard on her chair. I got here as fast as I could. You're not late, Grace said. We're on the rest notation. Show me. Grace showed her. Adelaide's hands moved over the board with the facility of someone who'd been coming to these lessons for 6 weeks and had developed a genuine aptitude that had surprised everyone, possibly including Adelaide herself. So the empty space has a mark now, Adelaide said. The silence is part of the music, Grace said. You can't just feel the sounds. You have to feel where they aren't too. Adelaide considered this in the way she considered things, with a fullness of attention that reminded Elena of Grace's own quality of listening. That's true of other things too, Adelaide said. Most things, Grace agreed. Jacob was watching them both. Elena caught his eye and found him already looking at her, and this time neither of them looked away quickly. He held her gaze across the room with that deliberate, unhurried attention of his, and she held it back, and it lasted long enough to be a declaration of something even if neither of them had the language for it yet. Then Adelaide said, "Can I try the drum section from last week again?" And the moment passed into the ordinary texture of the afternoon. Later, after Adelaide had gone home, and Grace had been set up near Harriet with the board, and a new problem Jacob had left her, a composition exercise, his notation applied to a pattern of her own making. Elena found Jacob in the back hallway putting on his coat. She said, to his back, "I need to ask you something." He turned. She'd written it on a piece of paper because she'd known she would need to, and she'd prepared it. She handed it to him. "Before Timber Ridge. What happened? You don't have to tell me, but I would like to know if you're willing." He read it. He stood with it for a moment, looking at the paper in the way he looked at things he was weighing. Then he reached for the pencil. He wrote for longer than usual. She waited. He handed it back. "I had a family, wife, daughter, 6 years old. Fever took them both in the same week. That was in Ohio, 8 years ago. I came west because I couldn't stay where the shape of the house was wrong without them in it. I stayed in the mountains because being alone felt better than being around people who expected me to recover in a way I could describe to them." Elena read it twice. She looked up. He was watching her face with that reading quality, taking in whatever she gave him. She wrote back, "My husband died 14 months ago. Before that, he was sick for 2 years. I learned to manage alone while he was still there, which was its own kind of lonely." He read it. He wrote, "The managing alone kind is harder, because there's no clear moment when you became alone. It happened slowly." She wrote, "Yes." They stood in the back hallway for a moment, holding their respective papers, the November wind audible against the outside wall. She wrote, "I'm not looking for someone to not be alone with. I want to be clear about that. I'm building something here. Grace and I don't need it completed by another person." He read it. He wrote, "I know. I'm not offering completion. I don't think that's a thing people can offer each other." She read that. She looked at him. He wrote one more line, "I'm offering Thursday." She looked at the word, then she looked at him. "Thursday," she said aloud, knowing he couldn't hear it, saying it anyway. He nodded. Whatever he'd read in her face, he nodded. She folded the papers and put them in her apron pocket and went back to the workroom, and she heard him go out the back door, and she sat down at the work table and picked up the needle, and her hands were not perfectly steady, and she let them be not perfectly steady for a minute before she made them work again. The following week brought the first snow that intended to stay. It arrived Tuesday and covered Timber Ridge in the particular way of serious mountain snow. Not decorative, not light, but the foundational kind that was setting itself in for the season and intended the ground to know it. The boarding house was warm because Harriet ran a tight stove, and the workroom was warm enough if you kept moving, and the customers came anyway because the cold weather was hard on fabrics and hard on the seams of coats and hard on the patience of women who needed things done and weren't going to let snow decide otherwise. Grace had begun composing. This was the word Jacob had used in his notebook, composing, and Grace had adopted it without ceremony, the way she adopted anything that was accurate. She was composing in his notation, building patterns on the board with a focused intensity that had taken over her Thursday afternoons and was beginning to spill into the other days. Grace sitting at the small table in their room with the board propped against the wall at an angle where she could touch it, and her pencil moving. Elena watched this development with the particular mixture of wonder and uncertainty that she'd learned was her primary mode of watching Grace. Wonder because the thing Grace was making was genuinely its own thing, not an imitation of the lessons, but something that had absorbed the lessons and become different from them. Uncertainty, because she didn't know what you did with a blind 8-year-old girl composing music in a notation system invented by a deaf man for the specific purpose of bridging the gap between hearing and touch, and she wasn't sure the world had a clear answer yet either. She mentioned this to Harriet. "What do you do with it?" Elena said. "Where does it go?" "Someplace everything she does goes," Harriet said, in the tone of someone who considers the question obvious. Forward. Adelaide Colton's mother, Margaret, came for a fitting that week and spent part of the time watching Grace work at the table across the room. She watched for long enough that Elena noticed.
What are you thinking? Elena said. I'm thinking Adelaide talks about this on every day that isn't Thursday, Margaret said.
I'm thinking she comes home and tries to explain it to James, and James doesn't understand it, but he listens because he can see that she understands it. And that's a different thing from Adelaide before. She paused. Adelaide before didn't have anything she understood that other people didn't. Elena looked at her daughter's back, the pencil moving. Grace before didn't either, Elena said. Not in a way that anyone could see. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Do you think there are other children like them? Like Grace and Adelaide both, not the same as each other, but children who learn sideways, who need a different door. Elena thought about what Jacob had written on the back of the board lesson that first day. The sound was inside her already. I only made a door. I think there are a lot of them, Elena said. I think they mostly don't get the door. Margaret nodded. She seemed to be arriving at a conclusion she'd been traveling toward for a while. My husband has some money set aside, she said. Not much, but some. And I know Dorothy Harding has been talking about what to do with the money the town raised after the explosion. The relief fund has more in it than the injured families need, which is a good thing, but it means there's a remainder. Elena's needle paused. Margaret, she said carefully. I'm not making a proposal, Margaret said. I'm just thinking out loud that there might be money, and there might be a need, and sometimes those two things find each other if someone points them in the right direction. Elena looked at Grace. Grace had stopped her pencil and turned her head slightly, the way she did when she was listening to a conversation that wasn't directed at her. I hear you thinking, Mama, Grace said, without turning. I know you do, Elena said. The third week of November, Jacob brought something Elena hadn't seen before. It was a box, small, about the size of a bread loaf, made from the same dark wood he used for the carvings but constructed rather than carved, fitted, and joined with the precision of someone who had spent serious time thinking about how things held together. The lid opened on small hinges that were so well fitted they were nearly invisible. Inside the box was a series of small carved forms, each one fitting into a shaped indentation in the bottom. 12 forms. Each one different: a circle, a half circle, a long rectangle, a shorter rectangle, a small dot mounted on a post, others. They were smooth under the fingers, and each one slightly different in texture. Some cross-hatched, some plain, some ridged along their length. Grace ran her hands over them for a long time. It's the notation, she said. You made it three-dimensional. He'd built it so the marks on the board could be felt in the round, each symbol a touchable object that could be arranged and rearranged in a line or a grid. You could compose with your hands rather than your pencil. You could feel the composition before you heard it, or instead of hearing it. Adelaide was beside Grace immediately, her fingers moving over the pieces. It's like writing, but you can hold the letters, she said. Grace was arranging pieces in a line. Her fingers moved with the swift certainty of someone assembling a system they already knew and were now meeting in a new form. Can I add pieces? Grace asked. Not asking permission, exactly. Asking whether the system was open. Jacob wrote on his paper, It's yours. Build whatever it needs. Elena stood in the doorway and looked at Jacob Thorne sitting across from her daughter, watching Grace's hands move over the pieces he'd built for her. And she thought about a man who had lost his family and come west because the shape of the house was wrong, and had lived alone in the trees for 6 years making things out of wood, and had then walked into Harriet's kitchen one Thursday afternoon and seen a small girl reach for a carved deer and known something from the way her hands moved. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not in the sweeping, dramatic sense, in the ordinary sense, the sense of someone watching you do a thing and understanding what the thing was without needing it explained. She thought about Thursday. She went to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them back and set one on the table within Jacob's reach. He looked at it, then looked at her with that steady, particular attention. She sat down in Harriet's chair, not at the lesson table, but near enough, near the warmth of the stove and the sound of the 2 girls working and the smell of wood shavings and coffee and the winter outside pressing its patient weight against the windows. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Across the table, Grace placed a long rectangle next to a dot on a post next to a half circle, and the pattern she was building had its own internal logic that Elena couldn't read yet, but that her daughter understood completely, and the morning went on around them with the reliable ordinariness of a morning that didn't know it was building something, And that was exactly the kind of morning Elena had learned to trust most. Not the ones that announced themselves, the ones that just kept going. Silas Caldwell arrived in February on a Thursday. Elena found this out from Harriet, who found it out from the stagecoach driver, who found it out from the Denver office dispatch, which was how most reliable information moved through Timber Ridge, not through official channels, but through the people who operated the channels without being credited for it. He came with a secretary and 2 lawyers, which told you something about how he understood the situation he was arriving into, and he took the rooms at the Ridge Hotel that were reserved for ownership visits and had not been used since August. The primary shaft had reopened 3 weeks earlier. The cable was new. The housing was new. The inspection board had signed off on both and on the secondary shaft reinforcement that had addressed Calder's corner. And Calder himself had been removed from his foreman position and replaced by James Colton, who was thorough and careful and had the quality that the best foreman had of knowing that the men in the shaft were always right when their bodies told them something was wrong. Brennan was still there. This was not a foregone conclusion. Elena had understood in November that his continuation depended on Caldwell's assessment of the inspection findings and what they said about whose decisions had led to the explosion. The findings were not favorable to Brennan, but they were not entirely damning either because the inspection record also contained the plain language account Elena had written of the rescue, and that account had things in it that reflected on Brennan's conduct during the crisis, if not before it. The list he'd used, the decision to send Jacob to the North Access, the speed with which he'd incorporated information and acted on it when acting was required. She had written the truth. The truth was not simple. She had written it simply anyway, and let it be complicated. Caldwell asked to meet with her on his second day. He sent his secretary with a note, formal and brief, requesting her presence at the hotel at 2 o'clock. She went. She wore her best dress, which was not what she'd worn on the stagecoach from Philadelphia, but which she had made herself from a wool she'd ordered in December. Good fabric, good work, the kind of thing that said what she needed to say without saying it. Caldwell was a smaller man than she'd expected. Mine owners in her imagination were large. He was compact and precise-looking, somewhere in his 60s, with the kind of attention in his eyes that went with a man who had made his money by watching things carefully and not telling anyone everything he was thinking. He had her written account on the table in front of him. He asked her to walk him through it. Not the rescue specifically. He'd had that from Price's report, and from Brennan's account, and from the inspection findings. He wanted the weeks before, the fragments she'd been collecting, the grinding equipment, the deferred reports, the shift in sound 2 days before the cable went. She told him. She was precise and calm, and she did not editorialize, and she did not protect anyone, including herself from the question of why she hadn't brought the information forward more forcefully when she first had it. "Why didn't you?" Caldwell said. "Bring it forward." "To whom?" she said. Brennan was the person who already knew and had deferred it. The inspection board wasn't due until February. I was a seamstress who'd been in this town for 6 weeks. What I had were fragments from conversations in a fitting room said to me by women who hadn't intended to say them. "And yet you wrote them down." "I write down things that might matter," Elena said. "I learned that from making clothes. You keep track of every measurement because you never know which one you'll need to correct for later." Caldwell looked at her for a moment. He had that quality that powerful people sometimes had of making you feel you were being added to a ledger and not knowing which column. He said, "Brennan tells me you've been providing him with information since December, conditions in the operation as reported through the families." He asked. I said I'd consider it. I considered it and I agreed. "What made you agree?" He was honest about why he was asking, Elena said. He knew he had a blind spot. He was willing to say that. Caldwell nodded slowly. "And the compensation he offered was fair," Elena said, which was also part of why I agreed. The corner of Caldwell's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I'm going to keep Thomas Brennan in his position, on the condition that the information arrangement you've described continues and is formalized." Elena looked at him. "Formalized how?" "I want a monthly written report," Caldwell said. "Conditions as you observe them through the network you've built with the families. Equipment concerns, safety changes, morale indicators. Sent to my Denver office directly, not through Brennan. And Brennan knows this. Brennan will know. I'll be clear with him that it's not a check on him specifically. It's a check on the information gap that exists in every operation where the men underground report to supervisors who report upward and things get lost in the translation. He paused. It's a check on the gap. You happen to be positioned in the gap. Elena thought about what it meant to say yes to this. She thought about what she was being offered, which was not just money. Though the money mattered, the money was real and specific and would change the arithmetic of her life in Timber Ridge in concrete ways. She was being offered standing, position, a function in this town's operation that was hers and that no one else was doing and that had a value the ownership was willing to acknowledge in writing. She thought about the stagecoach arriving, the envelope. I'm not raising someone else's broken thing. Yes, she said. On one condition. Caldwell waited. The relief fund remainder, she said. The money that was raised after the explosion and wasn't needed for the injured families. I want it directed to a specific use. He looked at her steadily. What use? There are children in this town who learn differently, she said. Not slowly, differently. Who need a different system than the standard one to understand things that they're fully capable of understanding? I want a room, a teacher's wage, and materials to begin working with those children. She paused. Grace will be involved. So will the man named Jacob Thorne, whose system of tactile notation should be part of the record of what this town produced. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. The ledger quality in his eyes was doing its accounting. That's not a small ask, he said. The relief fund has $412 in it, Elena said. I know because Dorothy Harding told Margaret Colton and Margaret Colton told me. That's enough for a year's start if it's managed carefully. You've been planning this. I've been paying attention, Elena said. There's a difference. He said he would take it under consideration. She understood this to mean yes, but slow, and she could live with slow. She walked back to Harriet's boarding house through the February cold, with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath making small clouds in the clear air, and she thought about the fact that she had just sat across a table from the man who owned the mine that had nearly killed 31 men and had asked him for money for a schoolroom, and he had not said no. She thought about how she would have described that scene to the woman she'd been on the stagecoach from Philadelphia. That woman would not have recognized the one walking back through the snow. That was probably as it should be. Jacob was at the boarding house when she returned. Thursday. He was at the kitchen table with Grace and Adelaide, and the table had the organized complexity of a lesson that had moved past its original boundaries. The board, the drum, the box of three-dimensional pieces, and a large sheet of paper on which Grace had been making marks that were her own extension of the notation, symbols Jacob hadn't put there. He looked up when Elena came in. He read something in her face and wrote on his paper, showing her good or complicated. She wrote back, both. He nodded as if this was the answer he'd expected. Grace said without looking up from the board, Caldwell said yes. Elena looked at her daughter. I said it was under consideration. You're walking like he said yes, Grace said. You walk differently when things are possible than when they're not. Adelaide looked up from the piece she was working on. What did he say yes to? Elena sat down. She told them. She told Grace and Adelaide, and through the back and forth of the pencil, Jacob. She told them about the room and the teacher's wage and the materials and the year's start that $412 could provide if managed carefully. Adelaide's face went through a sequence of expressions and arrived at something that was not quite excitement because Adelaide was too measured for pure excitement, but was something close to it underneath the measurement. Grace was quiet for a moment. Her hands rested on the board. Children like us, she said. Not a question. Children who need a different door, Elena said. She was thinking of what she'd said to Margaret. The words had stayed with her. Not all of them like you. Some of them like Adelaide. Some of them like other kinds of different. Children, the standard system loses. Grace turned her face toward where Jacob was sitting. Your notation should be in it, she said. The real version, the one we've been building. He'd been following the pencil relay and was caught up enough to write our notation. You built half of it. More than half, Adelaide said, with the flat honesty of someone who had been watching the thing develop for months and was in a position to know. Jacob wrote, more than half. Grace's mouth curved, not a full smile. Grace's expressions were always more interior than exterior, as if the face was just the surface indication of something happening at a deeper level. But it was there. Elena looked at the three of them at Harriet's kitchen table, the lesson spread between them, the February light coming through the window at the angle it came in. February, low and long and without summer's confidence, but present, genuinely present. She thought about what it meant to build something in a hard place. Not the romantic version of that. She had no patience for the romantic version, which required everything to resolve cleanly and the hard place to reveal itself as secretly hospitable all along, the actual version, which was that hard places were hard, and they stayed hard, and the building you did in them was never finished and never entirely secure and was always one bad season away from needing repair. The actual version was that you built anyway, not because you were brave or certain, but because stopping wasn't an option you'd given yourself. And somewhere in the middle of the building, the place started to be yours, not because it had welcomed you, but because you had put enough of yourself into it that walking away would mean leaving part of yourself behind. That was what belonging actually felt like. Not warmth and welcome. Weight. The good kind. Thomas Brennan came to the boarding house for the last time that winter on a Friday evening, the week after Caldwell left for Denver. He came to the front door, hat in hand again. Harriet let him in and called for Elena, and this time stayed in the hallway, which was her version of chaperoning. He looked at Elena across Harriet's front room and said, "Caldwell has approved the room. The fund transfer will go through the end of the month." Elena said, "Thank you for telling me." "He also told me about the monthly reports," Brennan said, "going to his office directly." "Yes." A pause. "I could take that as a slight." "You could," Elena said. "How are you taking it?" He looked at his hat for a moment. "As a fair arrangement," he said, "given what the arrangement addresses." He looked back up. "I'm not a man who changes quickly. I want you to know I'm aware of that as a fact about myself, not a virtue." "I know," Elena said. "What I said on the street, about your daughter." "You apologized," Elena said. "She accepted it." "I know that." He paused. "I wanted to say it differently, that I was wrong about what I saw. Not because of what happened after, not because she proved herself in the crisis. She didn't owe me a proof. I was wrong on the street, before any of it." Elena looked at him for a long moment. He stood under it without managing his face into anything. "She told you," Elena said, "that you couldn't see well. She said it that first day." "She was right." "She usually is," Elena said. "It's exhausting sometimes." Brennan made a sound that was, unexpectedly, almost a laugh. It didn't last long, and it didn't transform his face into something pleasant and easy, because he wasn't a pleasant and easy man, and that wasn't going to change. But it was there for a second, real and unmanaged, and Elena filed it in the same place she filed all the evidence she was collecting about what this town was and what it could be. He left. Harriet closed the front door and stood for a moment with her hand on the latch. "Well," she said. "Don't," Elena said. "I was going to say he's a complicated man who is trying, in his slow, complicated way, to do better, and those are not the worst men." "No," Elena agreed, "they're not." "The best men are easier," Harriet said, "but there are fewer of them." They stood in the front hallway for a moment, the two of them, in the easy silence that had developed between them over the months. The way things developed between women who spent a lot of time in the same house and had decided at some point without announcing it to trust each other. Then Harriet went back to her kitchen, and Elena went back to her workroom, and the evening continued. The room opened in April. It was not the building Elena had imagined in February. It was smaller, one room above the dry goods store that the owner was willing to rent for a reasonable rate because his daughter was one of the children who would use it, and the materials were modest, and the teacher's wage was enough to draw a young woman named Clara Webb, who had trained for teaching in Ohio and had come west with her husband and found that Timber Ridge's existing school had no use for her particular approach, which was patient and flexible, and held the strong opinion that there were as many ways to understand something correctly as there were minds trying to understand it. Clara Webb met Grace and spent 40 minutes talking to her, and at the end of the 40 minutes said to Elena, "I should be learning from her, not teaching her." "Both," Elena said. "That's usually how it works." The box of tactile pieces sat on the table in the center of the room. Jacob had made 6 more sets so each child could have one. He'd also made something new, a set of wall-mounted pieces, larger, that could be arranged and rearranged at standing height, so a child who thought better while moving didn't have to sit down to work. Clara Webb saw these on the first day and spent 10 minutes examining them, and then looked at Jacob across the room with an expression of professional recognition. He couldn't hear what she said, but she said it anyway, looking directly at him. "This is good work." Adelaide Colton translated it onto paper. Jacob read it and nodded once, in the particular way he nodded when something landed in the right place. There were 7 children enrolled in the first month. By summer, there were 11. They were not all like Grace, and they were not all like Adelaide. They were 11 distinct versions of children who had been failing at the standard system, not because they lacked ability, but because the standard system had only one door and they couldn't find it. Clara Webb and Grace and Jacob between them. And it was between them, genuinely, each one contributing something the others didn't have, built other doors. The notation became a teaching tool beyond music. Its logic, the idea that information could be encoded in texture and shape and dimension and arrangement, not just in written symbols, applied to arithmetic, to geography, to the structure of a sentence. Grace spent 2 months adapting it and produced something that was no longer only Jacob's notation and no longer only hers, but a third thing, a new thing, that Clara Webb later wrote about in a letter to a teaching colleague in Ohio who forwarded it to a colleague in Philadelphia. Things moved slowly. That was the truth of it that Elena held on to when she was tempted to measure the progress against some imagined version that was faster and more certain. Things moved slowly, and they also moved, and those two facts coexisted without canceling each other out. She and Jacob married in October, a year and 1 month after the stagecoach arrived. Not in a ceremony with many witnesses, neither of them wanted that. In Harriet's front room, with Harriet and Margaret Colton and James Colton and Adelaide present, and Grace standing beside Elena with her hand in her mother's and her face doing the interior thing it did when something confirmed what she already knew. The judge who performed it was a small man who'd been doing civil ceremonies for 20 years and had learned to read what kind of ceremony a couple wanted and give them exactly that. He was brisk and genuine and didn't add anything that wasn't necessary, which was exactly right. Afterward, Harriet produced a cake that she'd made without telling anyone she was going to make it, and Grace found it on the table by the smell before anyone said anything and said, "You made a cake," to Harriet with an expression of mild accusation that made Adelaide laugh. "I made a cake," Harriet confirmed. "You didn't tell anyone." "Surprises are more effective when you don't announce them," Harriet said. Jacob was watching this from his side of the table. He caught Elena's eye. He wrote on his paper and slid it to her. "She's been planning that cake for a week. I saw the butter order." Elena looked at Harriet. Harriet looked at her ceiling with complete innocence. She kept the note. She put it in the box where she kept the ones she'd kept from the beginning. The note about the sound being inside Grace already and only needing a door. The note about offering Thursday. The note about the shape of a house being wrong without the right people in it. The box was not a large box. The notes in it were not dramatic documents. They were just the record of a conversation that had happened slowly, in a kitchen, in pencil, between two people who didn't have any other language in common, but had found that the one they built together was enough. What Elena understood, by the end of the first year, was something she could not have understood at the beginning. That belonging was not a thing that happened to you. It was not something a place offered or withheld. It was something you made slowly with the specific tools you had, the needle in your hand, the words you wrote down, the list you kept because someone had to, the door you went through even when it opened onto something you hadn't expected. She had arrived in Timber Ridge with nothing left. That was true, and she didn't revise it. But nothing left turned out to be a different thing than nothing to work with. You always had something to work with. The question was whether you were willing to find it in the form it actually existed in, rather than the form you'd planned for. Grace turned 9 in December and received from Jacob a carving. A small figure, not an animal this time, but a girl with her face tilted up and her arms slightly out, in the pose of someone listening to something the carver had heard but hadn't put into the wood. It was there in the space around the figure. The listening was there. Grace held it for a long time. "It's me," she said. He couldn't hear her, but he was watching her hands on the carving, and he wrote, "The version I saw first. The one that knew the wood was already telling a story." She turned the figure over in her hands, feeling its lines, its weight, the particular quality of the grain. The sound was already there, she said. She wasn't talking about the carving. She wasn't talking about the drum or the notation or any specific thing. She was talking about the year. She was 8 years old, and she was talking about the year the way a person talks about something when they've had long enough to let it settle into knowledge. It was, Elena said. We just found the door. Outside, the December mountains stood as they always stood, enormous, patient, indifferent to what the small, warm lights in the valley were building. But the lights were there, and they were warm, and they were building. That was enough. That had always been enough. Most people just needed longer than they expected to see it.
Hello, Vader. Welcome in. How you doing? Hope you're doing well. But could you imagine if I was creating a beanie baby hat? That'd be insane, Scoop. That would be fucking wild. But hey, not far off, man. Someone could be. Someone could be knitting or doing an Ami. Who fucking knows, man? It's possible. Is anyone working on something tonight?